Covert manipulation. Learn persuasion and manipulation techniques you need to influence people through emotional intelligence, dark psychology, and NLP. Win friends, persuade, and manipulates. Written by Robert Leary. Narrated by Ivan Bazinius. Introduction. Welcome to Covert Manipulation and Manipulation Psychology. Within this text, you will learn a variety of things that can greatly benefit you in everyday life. From persuasion, manipulation techniques, emotional influence, to NLP, the options are limitless. Really quick, before you begin diving into this text, I will be giving you a quick rundown of what you can expect within this book. Within the first chapter, we will go over the basics of what manipulation psychology is and the history behind the psychology of manipulation. After this, we will go into why people choose to manipulate others and where manipulation tends to pop up the most in the average person's life. Within the next chapter, we will go through some common expressions of manipulation that you may experience in everyday life. We will explain and give the most common methods or tactics of emotional manipulation that we see every day. You can apply these to both romantic and platonic relationships, as well as relationships within the workplace. These range from tactics such as raising your voice and lying. You'll go over many more than those two. That is just a standard. Within the third chapter, you will go into some in-depth techniques of manipulation. These will be more complicated and slightly more difficult to understand than the tactics and methods of the previous chapter. We will go through methods such as projection, denial, intimidation, conditioning, stalking, and much, much more. In addition, we will explain how words tend to contribute to emotional manipulation. You will begin to understand how dependent people are on language and how, as a result, this language can influence people. Within the fourth chapter, we will begin to discuss the power of persuasion. I will give you a brief history of the origins of the art of persuasion, dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I will then begin to explain how persuasion can be used in our everyday lives, from business transactions to simple negotiations. Within the fifth chapter, we will begin to discuss something brand new: neuro-linguistic programming. I will give an in-depth background and history on the origins of neuro-linguistic programming and will explain how neuro-linguistics programming is used to manipulate and manage those around you. Within the sixth chapter, we will begin to use our learned skills to gain friends. In other words, I will go through the skills that I have taught you in the previous chapter and explain how they can be used in the social sphere or simply the workplace. In the seventh chapter, I will explain how you can avoid manipulation within a relationship. More specifically, I will explain how you can spot manipulation with you or others and how to avoid a relationship with manipulative tendencies. In the eighth chapter, I will go over, specifically, manipulation within the workplace and how to spot it. In the ninth and final chapter, we will go through how you can defend yourself against manipulation. I will go through each tactic that we have discussed previously and give a brief description on how you can defend yourself against it. I will also go into how positive self-esteem can be used to overcome manipulative tendencies. Because of the importance of positive self-esteem in fighting manipulation, I will also give some tips and tricks on how to improve self-esteem over time. Within all of this text, you will learn many very useful skills you can use in everyday life. A lot of the skills within this text are not just manipulative skills that can be used to manipulate those around you, but also skills to fight back against manipulation and prevent manipulation in everyday life. A good portion of this text is also a history lesson. I teach a lot of history in this text on the background of different types of psychology and different psychologists that indicated certain ideals and theories. This is a very educational text that will greatly benefit you in the following ways. This text can help you learn how to better manage your social life, as well as get ahead financially. In addition, this text can also help you to pinpoint and spot manipulative relationships and stop them before they can even happen. If you find that you are already becoming trapped into a manipulative relationship, and that is why you are turning to this text, well, do not fret, because you will learn how to escape that manipulative relationship as well. This book truly is a jack of all trades and can be treated as such during the reading. Chapter 1. What is manipulation psychology, and why do people manipulate others? I'm sure we have all felt manipulated at some point or another. Manipulation has been present in our society since the beginning of time. In some form or another, manipulation is apparent every day in our lives. But what is involved in the psychology behind manipulation? What drives individuals on a psychological level to manipulate others? Within this chapter, I will cover all of this and more. Manipulation psychology. What is it? Before delving deep into how you can use manipulation to your benefit, I have to give you an idea of what psychological manipulation actually is. First and foremost, manipulation is a form of social influence in which the goal is to change the behavior of those around you through abusive or deceptive messages. This is often used to benefit the interests of the manipulator, usually to the expense of those around them. Words used to describe manipulative psychology are those such as exploitive, abusive, devious, and deceptive. Despite its connection to manipulation, an act that is inherently negative, the act of social influencing, is not always damaging or abusive. An example of this is when someone's friends, family, and doctors will try to change the mindset of someone who has unhealthy habits and behaviors. In a normal context, social influence is typically harmless in the fact that the individual being influenced is easily able to accept or reject it. The difference between this and manipulation is that social influence is not necessarily coercive and does not typically use underhanded methods to change a person's behavior. That being said, social influence and manipulation go hand in hand, as manipulation cannot exist without social influence. Another, less negative term used for manipulation is persuasion. Persuasion is used in a variety of ways in our everyday life. From advertisements to trying to decide what to eat, everything around us is trying to persuade us to do certain things at certain times. But what is the difference between persuasion and manipulation? Persuasive reasoning can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks, with Aristotle's ideas of logos, pathos, and ethos. When looking at these three persuasive methods, we can see that these are the building blocks of what would later become the basis for manipulation psychology, the subject of this text. The differences between persuasion and manipulation lies and the requirements for successful manipulation. The first of these requirements is the need to conceal aggressive intentions and behaviors. The second is having to know the person that is being manipulated. This means that you have to be aware of their psychological vulnerabilities and must be able to accurately decide which tactics are going to be the most effective. Finally, the last requirement for successful manipulation is having a particular level of ruthlessness and not caring about the harm that may befall the victim. Manipulation most commonly is achieved through the use of covert aggression. In colloquial terms, this is also known as passive aggression. Why do people manipulate others? Well, the answer to this question begins with fear. It begins with the fear that as things are in the current moment, the person in question will not succeed with the desired result from their own merits. Or they may be afraid that their life and the people around them will not provide for them or come to the favorable result. Sometimes they may also feel as though life and the people around them are quintessentially working against them. This is coupled with a fear that the people around them will gain and succeed in a way that they never will, and also that the limited resources in this world result in a dog-eat-dog scenario. They may feel that the situation and world around them need to be secured and controlled in order for them to succeed or simply survive practically, emotionally, and financially. They often have an innate feeling that somebody may gain the upper hand if they do not manipulate those around them. These feelings can come from the belief that a person has a lack of worthiness. This may come from their childhood. This may simply come from an unsupportive friend and family group. Either way, they feel that they are not worthy of their life working out well for themselves. They also struggle with the idea that they are not worthy of other people having their best interest in mind, and thus are attacked by these fears. So, at the base of all of this is a fear that causes them to manipulate others. This is fueled by the feeling that they are unworthy to those around them. These individuals also often experience what is called a lack of consciousness. In easier terms, this is the belief, sometimes without even realizing it, that you are not responsible for your own reality. People that suffer from this are unable to make the correlation between the events that occur in their lives and their internal selves. Or in other words, they may not understand that the way that their life around them is unfolding reflects how their emotions within them are shown. This often is also coupled with an inability to learn from previous experiences, and a tendency to repeat past actions expecting a different result. Unconscious people feel that the world is inherently unsafe. Because of this, in order to get results in this society, they feel they have to manipulate those around them. Even if the results of this manipulation do not bring them satisfaction and ultimately result in being emotionally or practically back at square one every single time. Instead of trying something new, like not manipulating people, in order to try and avoid the pain of this failure, the manipulator will create a new manipulation. But why doesn't the manipulation work the first time? This is because manipulation is not an authentic or true action. It is an action of defense in an attempt to stop the fear, pain, and unworthiness. Because of this, by trying to succeed using manipulation, as opposed to authenticity, the result is a sense of non-authenticity that can cause further damage within the mind and soul of the manipulator. Because of all of this, we can come to the conclusion that a person who manipulates does so because they feel unworthy within their core. So in order to properly pinpoint the signs of manipulation in our lives, we need to know where they pop up the most common. In order to fully understand these areas of manipulation, we have to keep in mind that not all who manipulate are conscienceless. Narcissists have also been known to go to extreme lengths to manipulate those around them. I will not go into detail upon the reasonings behind a narcissistic person manipulating those around them, but understand that it still comes down to the idea of being unworthy. One very common way that manipulation shows up in everyday relationships and life is with people who have a fear of abandonment. Somebody with a fear of abandonment will do anything to ensure that those around them, especially romantic partners, do not leave them or abandon them. This often results in manipulative tendencies in order to make sure that those around them need them. Understand that somebody suffering from this issue is not inherently a terrible person. They're simply suffering and struggling to deal with a negative internal image of themselves. They may have an inability to understand that they themselves are lovable and worthy by simply existing. Once shown the error in their ways and offered help, these individuals will most likely make an attempt to change their ways. These individuals often have trouble keeping romantic relationships. Probably the most common scenario in which somebody manipulates another, and also a situation you can probably relate with, is trying to manipulate somebody to spend their money. This can be manipulation by a spouse to get the other spouse to purchase something for them. Or it can also be seen on a larger scale with the manipulation by advertisements and big businesses to try and get you to spend your money on their product. I'm sure we can all relate to the latter. We can also find a lot of examples of manipulation in the political sphere. Politicians are often well known to manipulate their audiences into supporting their agenda in various ways. The manipulation of these people is often much more subtle than traditional manipulation because it has to fly under the radar of other politicians around them. This manipulation often includes suggestive manipulation, that is, manipulation by suggesting negative consequences for not supporting them. Another very common but less destructive version of manipulation is the manipulation of children in order to help their parents. This type of manipulation is different from the kind we have discussed because, while manipulative, it's not necessarily negative. Parents will often do this to encourage their children to help with chores or to learn necessary skills. We can also see this in parents trying to encourage their children to make good grades in school by purchasing gifts or giving money if their grades were at a certain level. While this may seem like a positive form of manipulation, this idea actually damages the mind of the child and is not recommended as a form of encouragement. Another example that is much darker: kidnappers are often known to build a relationship or rapport with a child they're planning on kidnapping. They are manipulating the child by being nice to them and offering them gifts so that they can trust them. Probably the most common form of manipulation that we see in everyday life is the action of a man or a woman who is interested in a man or woman giving them anything that they want so that they can get money or influence from that person. As we can see within this chapter, manipulation has a much more complicated background than people often believe. It does not come down to that individual simply being a bad person. What is the result of many beliefs and feelings that have been hammered into them since childhood? We can also see that manipulation has a long and deep history, going back to the ancient Greeks as we've discussed. We've also discussed fairly in depth the reasons why people are seen to manipulate others, as well as the most common events that manipulation is seen to pop up in people's lives. This background is essential for the rest of the information that will be learned within this text. In the next chapter, we will begin to go into the most common expressions of manipulation. We will also begin to explain and give some of the most common and widely seen tactics of emotional manipulation. These are only the basics and will only scratch the surface of the depth of manipulation. Chapter 2. Common Expressions of Manipulation and Basic Emotional Manipulation Tactics. Within this chapter, we are going to go over some of the most common expressions of manipulation and how to spot them. We will also go over some of the most basic emotionally manipulative tactics. Expressions of manipulation. Most of the common expressions and phrases of manipulation are related to relationships. You may notice that as a trend within this portion of the text. This is because those that are in relationships have the most power over the person they are in a relationship with, and they are also the most vulnerable. This phenomenon can make certain individuals feel as though they must manipulate in order to feel secure. The first phrase or expression we're going to go over is the following: "Why are you still mad at me? I bought you a gift." This phrase is manipulative because it uses two methods of manipulation that have been identified by the psychologist Herbert A. Simon. These two methods are known as rationalization and minimization. Rationalization is an excuse that has been made up by the manipulator to redeem themselves for inappropriate or negative behavior. This form of manipulation is often coupled with minimization, which we will discuss next. Minimization is a form of denial that is at the expense of the person being manipulated. Within this method, the manipulator suggests that the feelings of the person being manipulated do not matter or are of less importance by suggesting that the events that they are upset about were not harmful or negative in the first place. This, coupled with rationalization, makes for a very powerful form of manipulation. Within the expression given, the manipulator is using minimization within the question, "Why are you still mad at me?" By making the manipulated person's anger seem irrational, he minimizes their feelings. They then follow it up by saying, "I bought you a gift," which is the rationalization aspect. The manipulator is rationalizing, making their previous actions seem okay by purchasing the manipulated individual a gift. The next phrase we are going to go over is the following: "Stay home and let me take care of you. This is what's best for the kids." This phrase is very manipulative and uses two huge emotionally manipulative tactics. The first one that it uses is a very powerful one known as a guilt trip. Using a guilt trip in a manipulative sentence is very powerful because it makes the victim feel negative about themselves. They may begin to experience self-doubt, anxious, or feel submissive to the person doing the manipulating. The next method of manipulation that is used in this phrase is known as playing the servant role. This method was also indicated by Herbert A. Simon. Within this method, the manipulator hides their self-serving agenda under the idea of service to an honorable cause. This form of manipulation is also quite powerful because it makes them appear as though they are a superhero or some type of noble human being acting out of service. In addition to placing the manipulator up onto a pedestal, this form of manipulation also manages to rationalize the action of the manipulator under the guise of them being obedient or acting like servants. Within this phrase, the manipulator uses guilt trip by saying, "This is what's best for the kids," by preluding this guilt trip with the phrase, "Stay home and let me take care of you," which makes them appear as though they are acting in the servant role in this situation. Overall, the effect of using these two methods together within this phrase makes the manipulator appear like a very generous and kind person, while making the manipulated individual feel guilty and ashamed for not wanting to do what the manipulator wants. Another very common phrase used in manipulation is as follows: "Don't leave me. I might hurt myself." This is probably the most dangerous and powerful form of manipulation that we've discussed so far. This phrase is incredibly powerful and effective at manipulating an individual because it makes them feel as though they are responsible whether or not the manipulator injures himself. This phrase of manipulation can fall under many different methods of emotional manipulation. The first that I see here is known as projecting the blame or blaming others. In this method, the manipulator makes it look as though the victim is the one doing something negative or harmful to the manipulator, whether they truly are or not. This makes the victim feel as though they are to blame for the actions of the manipulator. This is often very effective and believable by the victim. It's also good to note that manipulators using this method often accuse the victim of being crazy, especially when there is a strong evidence against the manipulator. This manipulative statement couples the previous method with a new method known as playing the victim role. Within this method, the manipulator makes themselves appear as the victim of the circumstances, or as the victim of somebody else's behavior, in order to evoke pity, compassion, or even sympathy within the actual victim. This method is especially powerful if the manipulator knows that the person they're manipulating is a caring or generous person. This is because the manipulator knows that the person in question would not be able to handle seeing another person suffer, and thus the manipulator is able to play on that person's sympathy easily. This method is especially dangerous because it plays on our innate empathetic sense. Within this expression, the manipulator uses the idea of suicide, a very serious and dangerous prospect, to gain sympathy from the victim that they are manipulating. They also manage to project the blame of this dangerous and powerful action, suicide, by making the victim feel as though their actions, leaving the manipulator that is causing the manipulator's suicide. This makes the victim feel as though they are the cause of the manipulator harming themselves, and if the victim is a sympathetic type of person, they will do anything to prevent this from happening. This is why this method is so powerful. The final phrase that we are going to cover that is commonly used to manipulate others is the following: "You made me do this." The manipulation within this phrase is fairly obvious and uses a form of manipulation that we have already gone over. That is the idea of projecting blame onto the victim. By telling the victim that their actions forced the manipulator to do whatever it was that they did, they can make the victim feel responsible. As a result, the victim feels as though they must do something to right whatever wrong they believe that they did. This manipulative statement is easy to spot and is often a last-ditch attempt of a manipulator to get their victim to do what they want when they feel they have been backed into a corner. The reality of the matter is that the victim only has control over their own actions. The actions of the manipulator cannot be controlled by the actions of the victim. In reality, the manipulator chose to act the way that they did and have to learn to understand that it was them who decided to do whatever it was in the first place. This statement can sometimes be followed up with accusations of the victim manipulating the manipulator. Tactics of manipulation. In this next section, we will be discussing some common tactics of emotional manipulation. The first tactic of emotional manipulation that we will be going over is very common in everyday life. This tactic is known as lying. Lying, or gaslighting as some know it, is very common in emotional manipulation because it is so easy to do. It is used to intentionally keep the victim feeling off balance in their life. If an individual is feeling very off balance in their life, they are less likely to question the actions or ideas of those around them, which is beneficial to the manipulator. It can also be used to make the victim seem like the bad guy, and is very commonly used to twist a situation against the person being manipulated. This tactic is one used to try and maintain control in a scenario, and can often lead to lack of trust in relationships. The way that a manipulator using lies to manipulate somebody makes them start to lose a connection with their instincts because they're being convinced that their instincts are wrong. When this happens consistently over a long period of time, it can cause a lot of turmoil. This turmoil is usually beneficial to the manipulator, because if the victim is not sure of themselves, they will not have the strength to fight back against their manipulator. This can also prevent a victim from reaching a proper solution to a problem and blind them to dangerous events that are happening around them. This method is also often coupled with a tendency to point out things about the victim that are damaging to their self-esteem, but also completely unrelated to the matter at hand. Doing so does not only lower the self-esteem of the victim, but also serves to produce a feeling of confusion in the victim. As we have discussed before, confusion and feeling offset is very beneficial to the manipulator because it is easier for them to get away with their manipulation with these feelings in place. The next form of emotional manipulation that we will discuss is when a person raises their voice at another. the sound of a person raising their voice just on a psychological level invokes an innate sense of panic. This is psychological and completely instinctive. It's something that nobody can really stop themselves from feeling. Because of this is a very powerful form of manipulation. The sound of a person raising their voice against another invokes a sense of panic in the person being yelled at. This sense of panic is incredibly beneficial to the manipulator, because in a moment of panic, the victim will be willing to do anything they can just to stop the yelling. The innate sense of fear and terror that comes from the sound of somebody raising their voice at an individual puts the victim onto the very shaky ground and makes them feel as though they are in the wrong. This is because the sound of somebody raising their voice at you brings you back to when you were a child, and your parents would chastise you for doing something wrong. At a subconscious level, the sound of somebody raising their voice makes you feel like a child because of this connection. This is all very beneficial to the manipulator, because if the victim feels like a child, then they feel as though they have no control. A manipulator needs their victim to feel as though they have no control over the situation in order for the manipulator to maintain their own control. A manipulator's ability to manipulate is very strongly based on the delusions of the person they are manipulating. If that person feels as though they have no control over a situation, then it'll give the manipulator more control over the said situation. In addition to all of this, the sound of somebody raising their voice is also very prone to elicit panic and unsureness in the victim, because the sound of somebody raising their voice is a sign that precedes an action. And in the case of a manipulator, the victim may never know what that action is. The manipulator could be planning on harming them, or simply breaking something, or they might not do anything at all. But it's the idea that they could do any of these things that creates panic in the victim and gives the manipulator their power. This is a very powerful form of manipulation and is typically used on women. This is because women's aggressive tendencies tend to show themselves in more passive ways at first. While a woman can be driven to yell, yelling is typically one of the last things they do before a more serious form of aggression. Because of this, when a woman is shouted or yelled at, they usually take that as a sign that the person yelling at them is on their last straw. This has more of a desired effect on a woman than it would have on a man, who more readily raises their voice in anger than do anything else. The next method of emotional manipulation we will be discussing is known as victimization. Victimization, or victim playing, is the invention of false victimhood of an individual. This is used for a variety of reasons other than manipulation. This can be used to justify the abuse of another person. This can be used as a coping strategy, or this can also be used to seek attention. The justification of abuse goes hand in hand with the use of this method for emotional manipulation. This method works by dehumanizing the victim in order to divert the attention away from the acts of abuse by the manipulator. This is done by claiming that the abuse was justified because of the victim's prior bad behavior. I would like to note that this is very common in physically abusive romantic relationships. Strategy is often used by the manipulator or the abuser to keep that person that they are physically or emotionally abusing from realizing that they are being abused in the first place. By placing the blame onto the victim, they trick the victim into thinking that everything that's wrong in the relationship is because of the victim. This is, of course, not true, but that shows how powerful this form of manipulation is. It's almost a sort of reverse psychology in a way. By placing doubt onto the person being manipulated by the manipulator is more easily and readily able to weave in and push their own agenda. which in the case of an abuser is typically not to lose the abused or get arrested. This can also be known as grooming the victim by attracting a sort of sympathy from those around them in order to gain support so that they feel more justified in the abuse of the victim. This method serves more than simply justifying their actions to the victim or those around the victim. This method also serves to justify the actions of the manipulator to themselves. Most individuals do not want to think of themselves as an evil, abusive, manipulative person. So, by justifying their actions by blaming the victim and making themselves believe that they were only acting as a result of the victim's actions, they can rationalize their behavior so that they do not hate themselves. A difference in the way that they treat those around them and what they believe themselves to be is known as cognitive dissonance, and the use of this justification is known as existential validation, because it helps them deal with the cognitive dissonance that results from the differences in how they actually act and how they believe they act. While this method is very powerful in the short term, this tactic seems to be less successful over time. Those that feel sympathy for the manipulator because of the manipulator's ability to seem like the victim will in a short term feel as though they need to rescue or help the manipulator, and by doing so will further push their agenda. But as time goes on and there is no movement toward anything better in the manipulator, those heroes will feel as though they are wasting their time and become frustrated at the lack of improvement. Eventually, this has been shown to make the sympathetic individuals leave the manipulator no matter how much he plays the victim. Playing the victim can also be used as a technique to seek attention. Many people in our world today are very addicted to attention, either because of a childhood issue, a lack of love in their life, or simple narcissism. Attention is constantly being searched out in our modern world. Playing the victim is the easiest way to gain attention from those around you, because we as humans are attracted to pain and suffering whether we like to admit it or not. So, by playing the victim, a manipulator is able to get the attention they want and need. Because of this attention giving positive feedback on a manipulator's actions, it is often hard for a person to stop using this method once they've begun using it regularly. It almost becomes like an addiction, because it feels good emotionally to have people around you feeling sympathetic and wanting to help you. The only way to break the cycle within a person is to convince them to take responsibility for their own desires and to be willing to put forth long-term actions on their own and without the help and guidance of others. They need to recognize that their life is in their own hands and that they make their own choices in the world. Another method of emotional manipulation is the act of a manipulator to act superior to those around him. By acting as though they are somehow superior to their victim, the manipulator plants a seed in the victim's head that perhaps they are not good enough. Whether or not this is true, it tends to work. Victims who began to believe that they themselves are lesser than the manipulator that is manipulating them will tend to have a lower sense of worth, and as such will have a hard time understanding that the abuse coming from the manipulator is not their fault. This will make it much easier for the manipulator to swoop in and push their own agenda. There are many covert and secretive ways that a manipulator can convince a victim that they are superior to them. The first one is pretty straightforward, simply acting as though the manipulator is of a higher standing than the victim. Oftentimes, this comes through by the manipulator treating the other individual as though they are a child or somehow incapable of doing simple adult tasks. They may do this through the use of condescending comments or facial expressions. This can also come through in more ways than simply treating someone like they are a child. However, this also comes through by the manipulator pretending as though they have a higher stance in a business ladder form than the victim, whether this is true or not. This may include very simple actions, like taking some of the roles of the victim in a business setting. Let's say, for instance, that the victim is of a higher prestige than the manipulator. Let's say that one of the responsibilities of the victim is to turn in expense reports on time. The manipulator in this situation might take the expense reports from that person's desk and turn them in a day early, joking about it later, saying that perhaps they should have had the victim's job because they can clearly do it better. A second scenario in which a manipulator can convince a victim that they are above the victim is by using a few key phrases that we hear pretty often amongst abusive relationships. Each of these phrases has a similar quality in that they put down the other individual for their emotions or feelings. They also tend to have a condescending or patronizing tone that is meant to belittle the victim. A few of these phrases are as follows: "Don't be silly," "Don't be stupid," "You're being ridiculous." As you can see, within each of these phrases, the victim is being put down or belittled in some way. These phrases are very effective because they are very covert. When you are the victim in this situation, it is very difficult to tell that you are being put down by these phrases. They make you feel as though you aren't thinking straight, and the person that is manipulating you is the only one that has a good sense at that moment. Another way that a manipulator can act superior to their victim in a subtle way is by making jokes about the victim. This is especially effective when done in front of other people. When using this technique, manipulators are often making jokes that are about things that the victim is actually insecure about, and the manipulators usually are aware of this fact. What makes this technique so effective is the fact that it is very hard for the victim to fight back against a manipulator in these situations. Any attempt to ask the manipulator to not talk about the things that the victim is self-conscious about only results in the manipulator saying things like, "We're only joking," and "Don't be such a hard ass." These famous phrases legitimize the jokes that the manipulator made at the victim's expense to the people around the victim. This makes it especially hard for the victim to fight back because we, as humans, are very weak to our social status. In other words, it is very hard for a human to fight back against manipulation that is happening against them when they do not have large and strong support systems around them. By legitimizing their jokes to the people around the victim, the manipulator poses a risk to that group of support that the victim relied so heavily on. The final technique for manipulating somebody emotionally that we will discuss in this chapter is known as gaining control. This may sound very generic and like something that we have already talked about, but this version of gaining control is much less subtle than the other messages we've discussed. Gaining control in this sense has to do with having some form of leverage over the person that they are trying to manipulate. It can be in several different fields, from the social sphere to their economic well-being, to simply making the victim feel as if they have no choice in simple decision-making. This is more specific to obvious displays of control in a relationship. Socially, a manipulator can have control over a victim by befriending all of the victim's friends and gaining their trust in a way that would make the victim feel as though they could not complain to their friends about the manipulator. This is particularly damaging because, as we have discussed before, victims need a large support group in order to break away from their manipulator. From an economic standpoint, a manipulator can have control simply by making more money than the victim. This is particularly effective in cohabitating relationships in which the victim of the manipulator lives together and the victim is dependent on the manipulator's rent or other bills that they may have to pay. The victim's dependency on these things gives the manipulator a constant and consistent control over the victim that is unwavering and easy to keep. This particular type of control is the one that we see most common in abusive relationships. A manipulator can also gain control in a relationship by making the victim feel as though they do not have a choice in very simple matters. These can be as small as not allowing the victim to choose who they hang out with or what they have for dinner. While this may not seem like very much, keeping the victim from being able to make those small choices themselves makes them feel as though they are ultimately powerless in the relationship. They feel as though their manipulator must make all of their decisions for them, usually at a subconscious level. Each of these methods of gaining control is very different, but they all go back to the same main point. In order for a manipulator to have control in a situation, they must make the victim feel as though they are on shaky ground in some way. They must make the victim feel as though they are not in control of their own lives. The mind is a very powerful thing, and by making the victim think that they do not have control in certain situations, it will ultimately result in them not having to control a much larger, more important situation. Control is the key word here. A manipulator needs control to be able to do their manipulating. Without having that control over another person, the manipulator does not have any ground to stand on. Within this chapter, we have discussed common expressions of manipulation that we see often in our everyday lives. Many of these expressions pop up exclusively in romantic relationships, but many pop up in everyday business transaction and amongst family and friends. In this chapter, we also spent some time giving and explaining some of the most common tactics of emotional manipulation that we see in everyday life. These are simply scratching the surface of tactics that can be used in emotional manipulation. In fact, there are hundreds of methods of manipulating someone emotionally that we have not even gone over yet. But in this chapter, we went through tactics such as raising your voice, acting superior, victimization, lying, and control. Within the next chapter, we will go through some more in-depth techniques of emotional manipulation. These techniques will be more complicated and more difficult to pinpoint in everyday life. Chapter 3. In-depth techniques of manipulation. Within this chapter, we will be going into some of the more complicated techniques of emotional manipulation. Amongst these techniques, we will be covering some techniques that were identified and discovered by famous historical psychologists known as Harriet B. Breaker and George K. Simon. Projection. Projection is easy to pinpoint within the manipulator because it often consists of symptoms such as being unwilling or unable to justify the manipulator's own shortcomings and to avoid being held responsible for anything they have done wrong in the past. In other words, a person using projection will project their negative behavior or actions onto another person by finding a very extended and unreasonable connection between an action of the other person and the action of the manipulator. This form of manipulation is also often used as a defense mechanism and tends to be instinctual for most people. While it is very common for people to do this without realizing it, there's a difference between projecting out of self-defense and projecting to manipulate. Projecting out of self-defense usually comes suddenly when another person is being accusatory or attacking the individual in question. This action is also usually followed up with the individual realizing what they have done wrong and taking responsibility for their actions in one way or another. A manipulator projecting to manipulate, however, is different because the manipulator will make this projection without being antagonized in any sort of way. They will often do it almost immediately after they have done their negative action and will preemptively project. They also will refrain from ever understanding that what they did was wrong and will never take responsibility for their actions unless somebody forces them to. An example of this would be an employee that has a history of rude or offensive comments complaining to another employee that their boss is incapable of keeping their office family friendly. They would make this comment in an attempt to escape the fact that they are the problem and not the boss or the office. Denial. Denial is a very versatile form of manipulation. Denial can be used in a vast variety of different ways in everyday life. Denial can be used to deny negative actions of the manipulator to help them seem like less of a manipulator to those around them. Denial can also be used by the manipulator to deny to themselves that they are trying to manipulate those around them. In other words, a manipulator might be able to convince themselves that they are not manipulating anybody, but simply acting of some different need or wants. This strengthens the power of the manipulator because the best actor or actress is one that believes themselves to be the character they're acting. This is the same with manipulators. A manipulator that believes that they are truly in the right in every sense of the word will more easily be able to convince those around them of that idea. There are many different ways that a manipulator can deny their actions or deny the actions of another subtly. They can do this using a method known as diversion. Using diversion, a manipulator will refuse to give a straightforward answer to questions and instead will move the conversation on to a different topic time and time again to avoid the said question. This is a way of denying the answer by not even giving it. A very similar but different tactic to this is known as evasion. These two tactics are often confused. The difference between diversion and evasion tactics of denial is that while diversion intentionally steers the conversation onto a different but interesting topic, evasion is more an act of giving vague and confusing responses that seem to have no meaning or are totally irrelevant to the current situation. This tactic is much less effective as it seems quite suspicious in almost any situation. Most intelligent manipulators will not use this tactic unless it is their last possible option. This typically means that somebody, or many people, will have asked a question that gets right to the heart of the manipulator's agenda, or will be putting a hole in the manipulator's strategy. Another word for this method is known as weasel words. Intimidation. There are many different forms of intimidation that can be used by a manipulator to control their victim. The first one we will discuss is known as covert intimidation. This is the subtle, indirect, or implied threats of a manipulator to a victim that puts the said victim into a defensive mindset. These threats are often not threatening of the physical manner, but rather that of the business, social, or economic sphere. These threats are very subtle, and this may not be picked up upon by people around the victim. By putting the victim onto the defensive, the manipulator gains a special kind of advantage. The manipulator gains the advantage of being on the defensive. In other words, the manipulator is calm, cool, and collected because they know when the next strike is coming, while the victim is jumpy and unsure because they feel as though the manipulator could strike at any time and they do not know when they need to be ready for it. This jumpiness is very advantageous to the manipulator because it makes the victim feel as though they are on shaky ground and are not in control of their future. As we have discussed before, this is very good for the manipulator because in order to maintain control, they need their victim to feel as though they have no idea what comes next. Think about this in the way of watching a scary movie. Throughout the entire film, you are sitting at the edge of your seat because you know that something frightening could happen at any moment. And because of this, something that normally would be very normal, like an owl hooting in the background, for instance, frightens you because you are on the edge in the first place. If you know anything about films, did you know that this was the desired effect of having the owl hoot at a crucial moment? Because after that fright, you may feel silly, or as though you cannot trust your instincts anymore, and thus are lulled into a false sense of security to then be attacked by whatever the actual scare was meant to be. Similar to a victim, with the manipulator, you are under the complete control of the filmmaking. Conditioning. To condition someone or something, the basic form is a process of learning that happens through the use of rewards and punishments, or desired or not desired behavior. This can also be called operant conditioning. In this particular form of conditioning, an association is made between a behavior and a consequence of that behavior. The easiest way to think of this in everyday life is the way that we train dogs. Dogs are often trained with the use of a treat for good behavior and a scolding of some sort for bad behavior. This is a form of operant conditioning. The connection of the desired behavior of the dog with a treat to the not desired behavior of the dog with a scolding leads the dog to subconsciously connect the desired behavior with a positive outcome. A similar training method can be used with humans, and the result is known as operant conditioning. This is not to be confused with classical conditioning, which is similar but not exactly the same. All of the steps leading up to the end result of both forms of conditioning are the same. The difference lies in the very last step. Operant conditioning is based on voluntary behavior by the individual being trained, whereas classical conditioning is based on the involuntary behavior of the person being trained. In our dog training example, the action of the dog doing desired behavior is a result of the operant conditioning. However, the dog being excited and expecting a treat after that action is a result of classical conditioning. This is because the feeling of excitement and expectation is an involuntary behavior that comes from the association of a treat with the action given. This pops up in humans as well. Let's say that you have a favorite restaurant that you frequent very often. This restaurant brings you great happiness and joy. As a result, you tend to like the waiters or the waitresses that work at this restaurant more than you would waiters or waitresses that work at a different restaurant. Because of this instinctual likeness, you tip the waiters or waitresses at this restaurant far more than you would waiters or waitresses at a different restaurant. The instinctive feeling of liking a person simply because they work at your favorite restaurant is an example of classical conditioning, while acting on that feeling and tipping the waiters and waitresses more is an example of operant conditioning. Now we can begin to see the connection between these two types of conditioning with manipulation. If a manipulator knows even the basics of these two types of conditioning, it becomes very easy for them to subconsciously train their victim to bend to their every whim. Let's say, for instance, in the case of a manipulative romantic relationship, a female partner offers her male partner sexual gratification every time that he purchases her a new piece of jewelry, and no other time. As a result, the male of this relationship may find himself purchasing jewelry for his female partner and becomes involuntarily aroused as he's purchasing it. The action of purchasing the jewelry is the result of operant conditioning, because it was a voluntary behavior on the man's part, but the involuntary arousal is a result of classical conditioning because of the association with buying his female partner expensive gifts and the resulting sexual gratification. This form of manipulation is especially dangerous because it can work completely undetected and be entirely involuntary. Involuntary habits are incredibly difficult for human beings to break. Because of this, establishing some sort of involuntary habit within a relationship gives the manipulator a consistent and steady standing that they would not normally have. These involuntary habits will, as we know, result in voluntary behavior, which is even more powerful for the manipulator because they can claim that the actions of the victim have nothing to do with them because they were of their own voluntary decisions. If it's done correctly, this form of manipulation is very powerful. Stalking and gossip. Stalking and gossip are very interesting and very dangerous forms of manipulation. When a manipulator stalks their victim, their intentions are very different from normal manipulative intentions. This is because oftentimes the stalking of a victim goes on unnoticed by the victim. This is different from normal manipulation techniques because most techniques of manipulation require or even depend on the victim knowing about the actions of the manipulator. This form of manipulation is very different because it is more a method of researching the victim. This is beneficial to the manipulator because it allows them to know the victim's vulnerabilities and insecurities. It can also allow them access to more personal aspects of their lives, such as their most inner family and friend group, as well as possible childhood traumas. This form of manipulation, of course, is very different from obvious stalking. There is, of course, a type of stalking in which the stalker wants their victims to know that they are being stalked. Obvious stalking, such as this, is more a method to elicit fear into the victim. A sphere is a tool used by the manipulator to keep their victim on their toes at all times. Taking away the safety net of a victim's privacy makes them more susceptible to a manipulator's actions. Now that we have properly fleshed out stalking as a form of manipulation, we can begin to discuss gossiping as a form of manipulation. While gossip is normally fairly insignificant and not the subject of psychological studies, gossip can also be used as a form of manipulation. False gossip, more specifically, is used as a form of manipulation. By spreading false gossip about an individual, the manipulator can often make them feel as though they cannot trust anybody around them. This is particularly advantageous to the manipulator because it allows them to swoop in and take advantage of a very vulnerable person at that moment. If the manipulator can convince a victim of gossip that they are the one in their life that they can trust, then they can typically convince that person to just about anything in their life. Seduction. Seduction is a form of manipulation that is very well known throughout history. It is often connected to attractive women seducing sexually frustrated men, but this form of manipulation can go both ways. This form of manipulation can include the use of conversation as well as sexual scripts. They may also use certain methods of non-verbal communication and paringual features. Historically, we can see many examples of amorous seductress or seductresses, from the demon Lilith to the fictional character Don Juan. Because of the widespread internet and common use of social media seduction, manipulation has increased significantly. This is most often seen in the world known as catfishing, in which an online persona seduces a wealthy man or woman into devoting lots of money or resources into this persona, only to find out that this persona was not who they said they were. This is made much easier to do by the emergence of the internet, because you no longer need to meet someone face to face to believe that they are real. Outside of the internet, seduction is also used widely in advertising and marketing campaigns to push products. Most often, seduction is used among manipulators to obtain a sexual partner for a short amount of time. Commonly attacked vulnerabilities. It is important to note when discussing the methods or tactics commonly used by manipulators what vulnerabilities are being targeted by said manipulators. That is what this section of this chapter will be covering. Within this section, we will go over common vulnerabilities with regular people that can be taken advantage of by a manipulator. The first one we will discuss is known as the disease to please. This is a huge vulnerability within our society, especially among females within our society. It is very widely accepted, especially within American societies, that people are constantly seeking to please others. This is especially clear within younger females within the American population. It is a long-standing patriarchal tradition of our society that women are under the constant pressure to please those around them. This is a subconscious belief that many people don't even realize they have about the women in their life. It can be as simple as asking a lady to smile because it makes them look prettier, or expecting a woman in your life to make you dinner. Without realizing it, simple beliefs and actions are constantly re-imprinting the idea that women live to please in American ideology. Whether male or female, this involuntary ideology is incredibly beneficial to manipulators and incredibly dangerous to victims. This is because the constant need to please that afflicts us and makes us want to do what will make those around us happy. It's because of this that manipulators find it very easy to convince people to do things they don't want to do. Another form of vulnerability that is often exploited by manipulators is the human's addiction to the earning of praise and acceptance by society. In other words, humans want to be accepted by those around them. If a manipulator is able to convince a victim that not following the manipulator's ideals will prevent them from being accepted in their society, then the victim will do anything that they can in order to please the manipulator, because they believe that that will bring them acceptance in their society. As previously stated, we are addicted to this idea of being accepted within our society. This is especially beneficial to manipulators, because they can hold the power of societal acceptance over their victims. Another common vulnerability that can be exploited by manipulators is known as emetophobia. This is a very common phobia that often does not get any sort of recognition or attention for its existence. Emetophobia is the fear of negative emotion or the fear of someone expressing anger, frustration, or disapproval. Some form of this is experienced within most members of societies. It is an inlaid instinctual feeling that is in most humans that greatly benefits us in the sanction of social connections and alliances with other humans. While this inlaid fear is meant to be a positive emotion or feeling to help humans, which are natural pack animals, to bond with the rest of their pack, it can also be quite dangerous to the victim of a manipulator. Upon discovering that a person has an exceptionally high level of emetophobia, a manipulator can very easily use this against them by simply expressing one of the negative emotions every time that the victim does something that they do not approve of. In some cases, this level of emetophobia is so intense that individuals will be inclined to do illegal or even evil acts in order to prevent their manipulator from showing any signs of disapproval in them. Another vulnerability that can be exploited by manipulators very easily is one that plagues many women in modern society. This is, of course, a lack of assertiveness and a lack of ability to say no. This is not to say that all women are less assertive than all men, but is instead a commentary upon societal pressures of women to not be as assertive as men. It is commonly viewed within our society that an aggressive or assertive woman is usually a negative attribute, whereas it would be a positive attribute within a man. Because of this, many women, despite their natural instincts to be assertive, find themselves pushing down that level of assertiveness so that they can more easily be accepted into society. The power of this societal pressure makes it very easy for a manipulator to come into a woman's life and make her push his agenda, because if that woman were to say no or act on her assertive instincts, she would be demonized by society. As previously stated, humans are pack animals, and anything that would set a human apart from a pack is often very difficult for a person to do on their own. Another vulnerability that can easily be exploited by manipulators is a plague of a blurry sense of identity or having soft personal boundaries. What this means is that an individual suffers because they aren't quite sure who they are yet and haven't figured out what their core beliefs and ideological systems are. Having this lack of identity leaves room for a minute to later come in and take advantage of this person. This is often an issue that plagues younger people more commonly because younger individuals haven't had the life experience or time to fully understand where they stand in the world. A manipulator that can sense a person with a blurry sense of identity may try to come in and fill that lack of identity with their own ideals or agendas. While the individual may not necessarily agree with every ideal of the manipulator, they may still allow them to push their ideals onto themselves because they don't know what else to fight back with. They also may have some issues if the manipulator happens to be older than them or somehow convinces them that they have more life experience than them. Because of the naive mind of a younger person, this individual may be inclined to allow somebody that they view as older and wiser than them to tell them what to believe. This, coupled with soft personal boundaries, gives way to a very dangerous playing field for the victim. Having soft personal boundaries means that an individual doesn't quite know when too much is too much. They can't quite tell if somebody is encroaching on their personal boundaries because they don't have a strict line in the sand. This is again a common issue with younger individuals because they aren't quite sure at which level of relationship personal boundaries should be set because they haven't experienced enough relationships yet in their life. All of the vulnerabilities that we have discussed so far have been indicated by the psychology we discussed before, known as a breaker. Now we will move on to some vulnerabilities that are easy to exploit by manipulators that have been indicated by the other psychologists that we discussed, known as Simon. The first one we will discuss is known as over-conscientiousness. Over-conscientiousness is when a victim gives everybody that they meet the benefit of the doubts. In other words, they prefer to give a manipulator a second chance rather than see them for who they truly are and drop them for their negative behavior. They also have a tendency to blame themselves because they don't want to admit that the person that they are with is a negative consequence on them. Another similar but very different vulnerability is known as over-intellectualization. With over-intellectualization, the victim wants to believe that everyone around them has some kind of understandable and intelligent reason for what they are doing. Because of this, they teach themselves that the manipulator must have a reason to be hurtful to them. This results in them blaming themselves because they come to the only conclusion that makes logical sense to them, which is that they must have done something wrong. Typically, this is not true, but they come to this rationalization because the idea of the person manipulating them simply being a bad person doesn't make enough sense to them because the manipulator may be charming or kind most of the time. Individuals most at risk of being manipulated. Within this section, I will discuss the types of individuals that are most at risk of being manipulated by a manipulator. The first of these individuals are those that are immature. An immature individual, often younger in age, is more at risk of being manipulated because they have not yet experienced very much in the world, and they do not know what signs to look for when searching for a partner. These individuals often do not know when a red flag is being raised. They intend to care too much about the people within their friend group to want to risk damaging the social hierarchy by attacking a manipulator. These individuals often have difficulty accepting that there can be dishonest people in the world. These individuals are also incredibly impressionable and easy to be convinced by charmers. Another individual that is very at risk of being manipulated is someone who is naturally very trusting and forgiving of those around them. Somebody who is very open and honest tends to assume that everyone around them is just as open and honest as they are. Because of this trusting personality, they are often more likely to put a lot of the leaf into the arms of a manipulator. They are most likely to do this without checking any credentials and are less likely to question someone who claims himself to be an expert, whether or not they actually are. Trusting individuals tend to characterize women, younger people, and the elderly. The elderly tend to be more trusting than the average individual because they're too tired from life to actually go through the steps of making sure that an individual they are hiring for an action is legitimate. This type of individual blends into our next type of person that is vulnerable to exploitation or manipulation, which is a careless individual. A careless individual is somebody who does not care enough to put in the effort to make sure that somebody in their life is not manipulative. Within the next section of this chapter, we will discuss briefly a political theory that has its basis in manipulation. Machiavellianism. Well defined as a political theory, Machiavellianism is also described in modern psychology as the type of personality trait. Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism is a phrase that psychologists use to describe an individual that emotionally detaches themselves from societal views of morality. They use this detachment to help reach their goals and thus deceive and manipulate those around them. A test was developed in the early 1960s to measure a person's level of Machiavellianism. This test is often referred to as the Machiavelli test. This test became a standard tool for self-assessment towards Machiavellianism. Individuals who score very high on the scale tend to agree to commonly used phrases such as, "Never tell anyone the real reason you did something unless it's useful to do so," while tending to disagree to phrases such as, "Most people are good," and "kind." Having a Machiavellianism personality makes it very easy for an individual to manipulate another. Without being weighed down by emotional sensibilities, an individual with Machiavellian tendencies will be able to think more clearly and push their manipulation further than an individual with lower Machiavellian tendencies. Many individuals with long histories of manipulating others will have a connection to Machiavellianism train of thoughts. Within the next section of this chapter, we will discuss how words can influence individuals and how words can contribute to emotional manipulation. Influence of words. Words are very powerful tools in the hands of a manipulator. Language and communication are very important to the human race, and a lot of weight is put onto the words that we say to one another. Keeping this in mind is very clear to see how manipulation through language works so well. There are many different methods to manipulate through language. The first we will focus on is pushing positive words while hiding negative information. This is seen the most often in advertising and in product placement. Take, for instance, a cup of yogurt that on the front of the label says that it's 95% fat-free. While this is probably true, they're leaving out the fact that this yogurt is also 5% fat. Whoever designed the label, or this particular cup of yogurt, conveniently chose to leave out the 5% fat that's in their yogurt in order to reach a wider span of audience. Another common method of using language to manipulate an individual is by discussing a topic while suggesting a different topic in a subtle manner. The listener in this situation may not even realize that they are being guided in a certain direction, but will give the desired response anyway. This language strategy has been investigated by Stanford psychologist Paul Thibodeau and Leary Boroditsky. Their tests consisted of giving participants certain crime statistics and explaining it to them in terms that either treated the crime like a beast lurking in the neighborhood preying on the town, or as a virus or disease infecting or plaguing the town. What you may ask is the point of this? Well, when given follow-up questions, participants that were exposed to the claims of crime as a beast tended to suggest solutions that were more violent or action-based. There were ideas such as capturing the criminals, punishing the wrongdoers, or hunting them down. As a contrast, individuals who are presented with the crime statistics as though it were disease tended to make suggestions of reform-style solutions. These were ideas such as to diagnose, treat, or give some form of aid to stop these criminal actions. The margin of difference between these two groups of people were much larger than the psychologist or those in the study would have ever expected. This experiment also goes to show how the way that information is presented to us greatly impacts our opinion on the said information. This knowledge is widely known by politicians, and most commonly used by said politicians to push their own agenda. Reading this, and listening to it with a logical mind and standpoint, we can understand that these phrases are simply metaphors. But why, when taken in context, can normal individuals not realize that metaphors should not be taken literally? At no point during this experiment was the crime involved having to do with an actual animal or an actual disease, of course. And we have to assume that the people involved in this experiment understood that. What seems to happen in between the reading of the crime statistics and the asking of the questions is that the one processing the information given through the metaphors activates the primary meaning behind these phrases that involve bestial activities. In other words, without realizing it, the individual reading the metaphors instinctively thinks of the crime as an actual animal, even though they logically know it is not. It is with this knowledge and through this way that manipulators are able to use metaphors and underlying meanings to get their point across through language. This is especially beneficial to the manipulator and dangerous to the victim, because the victim is not even aware that this is happening. The victim believes that their opinions and their ideals are coming out of their own thinking, when in fact it is being planted in their subconscious by the manipulator without them realizing it. The fact that the victim was not aware of this action gives the manipulator lots of space to do their work and lots of open ground to push their agenda further. Within this chapter, we've gone through some of the more complicated and in-depth techniques of manipulation. We have looked through methods such as projection, denial, intimidation, conditioning, stalking, and even more. Through all of these methods, we have found that the easiest way for a manipulator to manipulate their victims uses language. In the final section of this chapter, we discussed how language could be used to subconsciously push an idea in the victim without the victim even realizing it. In the next chapter, we will begin to discuss the power of persuasion and how the origins of persuasion are deeply rooted in society's history. Chapter 4. The Power of Persuasion. Persuasion has a long and deep history within our society. Persuasion has been long studied and has many connecting theories into its function and the best ways to persuade others. In the history of persuasion, it begins with the Greeks. The Greeks believed very strongly in rhetoric and elocution as the highest belief system for a successful individual. Most well known for his theories of persuasion, Aristotle listed the main reasons why one should concern themselves with the art of persuasion. The first is that the truth and justice are believed to be perfect, so that if a case is lost, it is the fault of the speaker. The second reason is that it is an excellent tool for teaching others. The third is that a good persuasive speaker needs to understand how to argue both sides of a case and understand all parts of the problem. The fourth and final reason that Aristotle lists for why you should learn the art of persuasion is that there is no better way to defend yourself than through the art of persuasion. Aristotle is most famous and most widely taught in our schools today for his 3 rhetorical proofs. These are, of course, the well-known ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is defined as a credibility of the person speaking. It is something you must convince your audience of in order to gain their trust. Logos is defined as reason and is often described as showing proof of your arguments. Pathos is often described as the appeal to an audience's emotions. This is arguably the most powerful rhetorical proof because it plays emotions of the audience listening. In addition to these rhetorical proofs indicated by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, there are many more psychological theories for the art of persuasion. Attribution theory. There are 3 subsections to the attribution theory of persuasion. The first is known as dispositional attribution or internal attribution. This form of attribution, in which an individual tries to point to a person's core traits or beliefs as a cause or explanation for their previous actions. An example of this would be a citizen criticizing a president's decisions because the president is lazy or lacks some form of economic prowess. The second subsection of attribution theory is known as situational attribution or external attribution. This form of attribution tends to point at a person's environment or surroundings or things that are typically out of the individual's control as an explanation for that person's action. Enter the previous example of a citizen criticizing a president. This would be when a person explains the president's decisions away by saying that they inherited a bad economy from the previous president rather than their actions actually causing it. The final form of attribution theory is known as the fundamental attribution error. This occurs when individuals incorrectly attribute either a failure or an accomplishment to the internal and core beliefs or attributes of that person. This is different from the dispositional attribution theory because play occurs between people who do not know each other very well. The person doing the criticizing does not properly understand the true attributes or beliefs of the other individual. Conditioning theory. This is similar to manipulation conditioning and has a huge play in the concept of persuasion. Conditioning is very effective in the world of persuasion because when you're conditioning someone, you're simply guiding them into making voluntary actions rather than directly commanding them to follow your ideals. This is seen most often in advertisements or commercials by trying to connect a positive or memorable emotion to a product or logo. We see this every day in commercials that attempt to make us laugh, use a sexual undertone, or use uplifting images or music. Professional spokespeople, such as athletes or celebrities, are also used as a method for conditioning. By connecting someone that you may love or respect greatly to a product, they're subconsciously making you feel good about that product when you see it in the store, whether you realize it or not. This is most particularly effective with advertising and consumerism because most purchases are made from an emotional background or value. By eliciting an emotion from the consumer, a product is more readily purchased by that consumer. Cognitive dissonance theory. This theory is very interesting and different from previous theories discussed under Persuasion. This theory was proposed by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957. Our original theory states that human beings are constantly searching and striving for mental consistency. He believed that our thought, beliefs, or ideas can be in agreement with themselves, unrelated to themselves, or in disagreement with each other. Our mental beliefs, or our cognition, can also be in agreement or disagreement with our actions or behaviors. When we internally can detect some conflicting ideas or dissonance, instinctually it can give us a feeling of incompleteness or discomfort. An example of this is a person who understands that smoking cigarettes is detrimental to their health and does not want to die at a young age, but who has been addicted to smoking cigarettes for a very long time and would probably suffer from cognitive dissonance. Within this theory, it is suggested that we are constantly striving to reduce this dissonance until our cognition is in balance and harmony in all ways. Festinger suggested 4 main ways that we as humans can reduce our cognitive dissonance. The first of the 4 ways is by changing our minds about one of the things that we have dissonance with. The second is reducing the importance of being in harmony in our minds. The third is to increase the overlap between the second and fourth and to reevaluate the cost-reward ratio. Using the example of the smoker we previously discussed when looking through these options, this man can either quit smoking, lower the importance of his own health, convince himself that smoking is, in actuality, no real risk for his health, or convince himself that the reward of smoking is worth the cost to his health. Cognitive dissonance is very useful in persuasion, because when somebody is feeling unsteady or uncertain about their own core beliefs or ideals, it is easy to steer them towards different beliefs or ideas. Within this chapter, we have discussed the history of persuasion as well as many theories and ideas of the art of persuasion. Within the next chapter, we will be discussing the definition of NLP, some background, and how you can use it. Chapter 5. NLP, a background, and how you can use it. NLP stands for neuro-linguistic programming, and it is an approach to communication, personal development, and psychotherapy that was designed and indicated by Richard Bandler and John Grinder in the early 1970s. These 2 individuals believe that there is a connection between the neurological process of language and the behavioral patterns that are learned through experience in a person's life. They also believed that these learned patterns could be changed in order to achieve specific goals. They believe that the NLP methodology can mimic the skills of exceptional people, allowing anyone who uses this method to acquire those skills. They use an LP in their own practice and claim that in single sessions, NLP proved to be able to treat psychological issues such as phobias, depression, and psychosomatic illnesses. While NLP is marketed and used by some hypnotherapists, there is no real concrete scientific evidence that supports the claims of NLP advocates. Because this method is often disregarded as a pseudoscience, neuro-linguistic programming can be broken down into 3 main components or core concepts. I will explain these core concepts in depth right here. Subjectivity. Bandler and Grinder express that we experience the world subjectively. In other words, we tend to create subjective views of our experiences, meaning that 2 people can experience the same situation in the same way and describe it later with completely different feelings. This subjectivity is based on the way that we experience the world around us. This is felt most commonly through sensations of our 5 senses and language. The combination of these 2 results in an internal and mental language that we experience the world through. Think of a moment in which you are mentally rehearsing what you're going to say to somebody. Let's say you're going to order a meal at a restaurant. Sitting at the table, looking at the menu, you think in your head how you say what you want to the waiter. You may predict what their questions will be, and you may think about how you will phrase your answer. Subconsciously, without even realizing it, in this mental planning, you will also be thinking about the smell that's in the air, the feeling of the back of the chair you're sitting in, and the extra sounds that are going on around you. It is all of this extra atmosphere that make up your mental language. This mental language is believed to have a certain discernible structure and pattern. NLP is often working to study the structure of this mental language. The hope, by using NLP, is that you may be able to modify negative behaviors by manipulating these senses based on mental languages. Consciousness. Neuro-linguistic programming is dependent upon the idea that our consciousness is broken up into a conscious and unconscious component. The idea of language that our mental state uses daily works almost exclusively through the unconscious part of our brain. Learning. What sets neuro-linguistic programming apart from other forms of psychosomatic therapy is its imitating method. Professionally termed modeling is claimed to be able to reproduce a desired trait in any domain of activity. An important part of this form of learning is that it uses the idea of monkey see, monkey do. In other words, a desired trait is shown positively to an individual, and they are able to learn by simply viewing that positive trait to be carried out. Ways that neuro-linguistic programming can be used. Alternative medicine. Within alternative medicine, neuro-linguistic programming has been promoted very widely and commonly amongst common users. It has been said to be able to treat a variety of physical ailments. These can range from Parkinson's disease, HIV, AIDS, and even cancer. These claims have no real supporting medical evidence. Psychotherapeutic. Neuro-linguistic programming most commonly focuses on psychotherapeutic ideas. This is mostly due to the fact that the early models and idealists were psychotherapists. In the use of psychotherapy, neuro-linguistic programming shares similar core beliefs and foundations with many contemporary and scientifically backed practices. Some contemporary practices that have similar beliefs to neuro-linguistic programming is solution-focused brief therapy. It has also been acknowledged that NLP influenced these modern practices, and even that these practices may have come out of a form of NLP. These modern practices are slightly different from neuro-linguistic programming in that they seek to achieve desired behavior by shifting the context or meaning of that thought or behavior. How neuro-linguistic programming can be used to shift the ideas of those around you. Well, if one is searching to change the ideas of those in their lives, they can do so rather easily with the use of neuro-linguistic programming. To begin, they have to learn and understand the mental and internal language of the subconscious mind. Once they have understood this mental subconscious language, they can begin to shift ideals by modeling positive behavior and allowing those internal language pathways to pick up on this positive behavior and begin implementing it. Within this chapter, we gave an in-depth and well-fleshed-out explanation of neuro-linguistic programming. We gave some of the historical context as well as some common uses for neuro-linguistic programming. In the end, we also explained how neuro-linguistic programming can be used to change the ideals and beliefs of those around you. Within the next chapter, we will be using the learned skills within this text to gain friends around us. You will go through nearly every skill that we have taught you and gone over and explain how they can be used to make longer lasting friendships. Chapter 6. Using our learned skills to make long-lasting friendships. Within this chapter, we will be going back to the very beginning of this text and go through every skill that we have learned and give an example on how they can be used to make friends. Acting superior. This method needs to be used with caution when attempting to win friends in any sort of group setting. When used with subtlety, this method can make people subconsciously respect you and your decision and feel as though they live to serve you. In order to do this properly, it cannot be obvious or able to be pinpointed by the average person. You cannot act superior to those around you. You have to be superior to those around you. Victimization. Victimization, or playing the victim, is probably the easiest, most effective way to manipulate friends. If you can manage to constantly talk about how victimized you are in life, and can convince people that you are, you can get a vast amount of sympathy from those around you. This world is full of people that have an internal and undying need to help others. By playing the victim, you can play on this internal desire or need and use it to your advantage to become friends with somebody wanting to help you. Lying. It's pretty easy to see how lying can be used to gain friends. You can lie about just about anything to try and gain friends. You can lie about how wealthy you are. You can lie about your age. You can lie about your name. If these lies are convincing and easy to support, then people often believe them without too much question. Control. If you can use our previous methods to be in control of someone, then you can very easily befriend them. People are attracted to those that they view as being in control of them. It's a fact of life, and it is commonly seen in the martyring of political figures. You can use any of our previously discussed methods to make someone believe that you are in control of them. Conditioning. Conditioning is a very useful tool in the world of trying to make friends. All it really takes is some positive and negative reinforcement to positive or negative behavior. The best way to do this undercover is to make it a simple part of your day. Do something small for the person that you want to be your friend on a daily basis, and they will find themselves feeling happy when they see you and not quite understanding why. Let's say you really want to befriend Jim. Let's say that Jim always forgets to bring in coffee to work and end up having to go buy some. A good way that you can get Jim to start liking you without realizing it is by bringing him some coffee every morning and explaining it away with some kind of believable excuse. For instance, you could say that you are getting coffee for other people anyway, or that you have to pass by his desk going to the coffee machine. If you do this continuously as often as you can, and Jim will find himself feeling happy when he sees you without any reason to feel happy. Unless Jim's a master in psychology, he will probably simply explain away this feeling with the thought that he simply likes you as a friend. And just like that, you will reach friendship status with this man named Jim, who you want to be friends with for a long time. Within this chapter, we have learned how to use our skills to better and more easily win friendships in everyday life and in the workplace. In the next chapter, we will begin to go over how you can spot and avoid manipulation in a relationship. This can apply to both romantic and platonic relationships. This is very important to keep in mind when you're looking to manipulate other people, because it can be quite dangerous to have a manipulator being manipulated by those around them. Chapter 7. Avoiding Manipulation in a Relationship. With all of this discussion about ways to manipulate people, it is important to keep in mind that you also should be adept at avoiding manipulation in your own relationships. That is why within this chapter, we will be discussing how you can spot manipulation in relationships with you or those around you. We will also discuss how to avoid a manipulative relationship with you or those around you. If you find yourself in a manipulative relationship, I will also give you some tips and tricks on how to escape from a manipulative relationship. We are going to begin by discussing how you can spot a manipulative relationship from miles away. This can apply to romantic relationships that you are in or the others are in, and also can apply to platonic relationships that you are in or others around you are in. It's important to be able to pinpoint or spot a manipulative relationship so that you can avoid being in one yourself. Knowing the obvious signs of a manipulative relationship can also prevent you from showing those signs if you're choosing to manipulate somebody. The first sign that we are going to discuss that you should look out for when searching for a manipulative relationship is consistent accusations. If you find that in a relationship, accusations are happening frequently and are often being accused by the same person, it may be a warning sign that you or somebody you know is in a manipulative relationship. The reason that a manipulator may accuse their victim often and consistently is in order to provoke a discussion between the two of them. Typically, this discussion turns into an argument. Manipulators have greater control and heightened emotional situations such as arguments because in these situations, their victims are being blinded by their emotions and they are not able to see through the manipulator's manipulations. Manipulators are also brilliantly persuasive people, and as such, are very easily able to convince their victim that they're wrong in any situation. Because of this, provoking an argument with their victim serves very heavily in their favor. So if you often find that you're being accused of random wrongdoings, or end up losing the resulting argument, you may find yourself in a manipulative relationship. Please remember that this can also work from the outside. If you are viewing a relationship between a pair of your friends, and you notice that one of them is very accusatory towards the other one, keep track of the number of arguments that they may have between one another. If it seems to be a lot of arguments in a short period of time, and the same person is winning all of them, then your friend may be in a situation in which they are being manipulated for some reason or another. The second sign that we are going to discuss, and that you should look out for when checking for a manipulative relationship, is the playing of emotional games. People who manipulate emotionally often are trying to make their victims feel doubtful and insecure in themselves. This is because when a victim feels insecure about themselves, they are less likely to call out any actions of the manipulator. For obvious reasons, this is very beneficial for the manipulator. By keeping their victim on unsteady ground emotionally, they're able to more easily keep control of their victim. This may pop up in a romantic relationship by planting evidence of infidelity that later turned out to be inaccurate. By planting evidence of infidelity in a romantic relationship, even if you later make their victim feel incredibly angry or sad, may result in an argument or attack by the victim. At the end of this argument or attack, the manipulator will find some sort of proof that their infidelity did not happen. If they manage to convince their victim of their innocence, then this will result in a feeling of incredible emotional vulnerability and insecurities within the victim. Because of this, the victim will not feel as though they can trust their own instincts, and I will not be able to fight back against the manipulator. This can also pop up in platonic relationships with the use of backhanded compliments. By giving a compliment to somebody that seems like a compliment at face value, but in reality is an insult, the person being given the backhanded compliment becomes uncomfortable because they aren't quite sure how to respond. They can't get angry at the person complimenting them because to the surrounding people it appears to be a compliment. However, they also do not want to simply accept the compliment because it isn't a compliment but an insult. The resulting confusion and unsteadiness within the victim gives the manipulator room to sweep in and further control their victim. When checking for a manipulative relationship, you want to see if there is a history or consistency of backhanded compliments amongst the two people. You may also want to check and see if there is seemingly too obvious evidence towards some type of negative action of one of the individuals. If either or both of these signs are apparent in a relationship, then you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. The third sign of manipulation that you need to look for in a relationship that we are going to discuss is the act of breaking or damaging things that are important to the victim. This is a very obvious and physical form of manipulation, but it pops up quite often amongst both platonic and romantic relationships. This type of manipulation can oftentimes be explained away by blaming the victim and saying that they were in an argument, or that the victim made them very angry. These are not excuses. Manipulators are often very in tune with what is important to the victims of their manipulations. They typically know what some of the most important and prized possessions of their victims are. They use this to their advantage, because if in the heat of the moment they get too angry, then they may be able to destroy one of those very important items of the victim. They will do this for a variety of reasons. The first reason is they may wish to leave you in a sad or depressed state, which they could achieve by destroying something very close to you. If this item has any kind of emotional or nostalgic value, then it may serve a second purpose of making you feel as though you and your emotions are not safe. This is a very powerful feeling of emotions, which works very dangerously in the hands of the manipulator. A manipulator makes a victim feel as though they need a person to protect them from the world. This is a dangerous feeling because it leaves room for the manipulator to come in and convince them they are the ones to protect them from the world. In their emotional state, a victim will not realize the irony behind this, as the person trying to protect them is also destroying the things they love. In checking for a manipulative relationship, you will always want to watch out for this type of behavior. In either a platonic or romantic relationship, somebody destroying something that is important to another person is very manipulative and cannot be ignored. The fourth type of warning sign that we will discuss, but you need to keep an eye out for when looking for a manipulative relationship, is the encouraging of jealousy within a relationship. This type of manipulation is most common in romantic relationships, but it can also pop up in the platonic relationships under the correct circumstances. Jealousy is a hugely damaging emotion for a person because it tends to encourage a lack of trust in a relationship, which is very beneficial to the manipulator. Manipulators are very conscious of this and know that they need their victims to trust them, but they also know that they themselves cannot trust their victims. Manipulators feel as though their victims could turn on them at any moment, and because of this, incite a huge amount of jealousy within themselves. Most people understand the concept that when a person is jealous of somebody else, and incite a feeling of uneasiness and sadness within themselves. This may lead a manipulator to try and incite jealousy within their victim. You may do this by flirting very obviously with others in front of their romantic partner, or may even try to compare their victims to strangers. Doing this puts their victim under the sense of unease and makes them feel as though they are not good enough. Because of this feeling of not being good enough, it will feel as though they need to constantly be gratified and assured by the person that is manipulating them. This is very powerful for the manipulator and very dangerous for the victim, because by giving the manipulator the power to decide whether or not the victim feels gratified and safe with the manipulator, who can then choose how the victim feels at any given point. If you are checking for manipulation in a relationship, it is important to check for this clear warning sign. If you're looking from the outside in, and you happen to be in public with a couple, and one of them is very clearly flirting with people around you, seeming to make the victim uncomfortable, you may be witnessing a manipulative relationship. If you are inside your own relationship, and you notice that your partner is constantly putting you down and comparing you to those around you, then you may be in your own manipulative relationship. It's important to keep an eye out for these obvious warning signs when checking for a manipulative relationship. The fifth warning sign that you may be in a manipulative relationship is that manipulative individuals will often act as though they are the victim of manipulation. This may seem confusing, and it can be somewhat difficult to understand if you are in the situation yourself. In order to fully understand and be able to pinpoint this warning sign, you have to be able to logically take a step backwards and look at the relationship from the outside in. This may seem difficult to do, but it is possible if you look at it from a logical standpoint. A person manipulating you in that relationship will often act as though they are the victims of a manipulative relationship. They may outright accuse you of being manipulative, and they will twist your words and make you feel guilty about something you did not even realize you did that wasn't actually wrong. They will try to convince you to apologize, even when you don't feel you've done anything wrong. If you fall into this trap, then you will become more and more prone to their manipulation and find it harder and harder to see their manipulation from an outside stance. The sixth warning sign that you may be in a manipulative relationship is an individual may try to make you feel guilty for a mistake that they made out of their own accord. Emotional manipulators are very good at finding ways to place blame on those around them. Let's say, for instance, that your significant other forgets something at home. This might be something very important to them, or it might be something very small. Either way, they may try to convince you that they forgot to bring whatever it was because you do not remember to remind them. If that person happens to be late for an event, it's because you didn't tell him the correct time, even if you do remember telling them the correct time. Every time this person makes a mistake, or are out of their own accord, they will find a way to make it your mistake before you've even realized what is happening. The easiest way to pinpoint this is to look at things that have gone wrong in your relationship and try to see if your significant other has ever taken the blame for anything that has happened. If the answer is no, then they may be manipulating you. This is very important to remember when checking for manipulation in a relationship. This is not only possible in a romantic relationship, but it is also possible in business relationships as well. Within a business standpoint, you may be able to see this form of manipulation most commonly amongst people of high standing and their assistants. A manipulator with an assistant is often very easy to go unnoticed by those around them because people may view it as simply the person doing their job. This is not always the case. If a person finds every reason to get angry at their assistant for doing things that really shouldn't even be in their job description, then you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. The seventh warning sign that you, or somebody you know, may be in a manipulative relationship is that the person doing the manipulating may rush the victim to make decisions. The act of doing this makes it more difficult for the person being manipulated to make rational and informed decisions in an instant. If somebody is rushing or pushing a person to make a decision very, very quickly, then they are putting that person under a certain level of stress that makes them feel helpless and doesn't allow them to make a good decision. Because of this, a victim may make decisions that they will later regret or that will have some underlying consequences. If this person is in a manipulative relationship, then the manipulator will refuse to admit that they are the reason that the person made these negative decisions. And while the manipulator is not directly the reason that the person made these decisions, they are the reason why the person wasn't able to think through their decisions before making them entirely. The manipulator will try to claim that the person made the decision on their own and should just try to live with their decision, even if they are not happy with it later. This is not to be confused with somebody refusing to accept responsibility for their own actions. A manipulator may use this as a tactic because when a victim is given less time to think through their choices, they're more likely to go with the decisions of another person. This puts the manipulator into a place of control because they can more easily decide what the victim wants to do next. The victim may have a hard time even noticing that this is happening. If you are on the inside of this relationship, and you notice that your significant other never gives you more than a few seconds to make a decision before calling you an indecisive person, you may be in a manipulative relationship. On the flip side, if you are on the outside of a relationship, and you notice that an individual is rushing their significant other to make a decision, then you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. We have mostly discussed this happening in romantic circumstances, but it is also very common in business settings. It is less of a negative action in a business setting and more of a strategy to gain the upper hand. Within the business discussions and negotiations, having a time constraint can often lead to a person making a decision in favor of a product they would normally not have chosen. A skillful negotiator and manipulator will be able to use this fact well and rush the person making the decision without them realizing or feeling as though they're being rushed. They might do very subtle things, like ask them what time it is, or look at a clock and know how late it has gotten. They may even remind the person making the decision of something that they previously said that they need to do before they leave for that day. The 8th warning sign that you should look for when checking for a manipulative relationship is when the actions of a person do not match their words. As we have discussed deeply within this text, emotional manipulators tend to use language to control people through a variety of methods. Because they were using this language does not always mean that they are going to act on whatever this language is promising to the other person. They may use flattering language and make certain promises in order to make you trust them or feel comfortable with them. The idea of keeping these promises for meaning these flatteries is only an afterthought to a manipulator. Because of this, these individuals very rarely will actually act out on these phrases that they make. If you were to call them out on one of their promises, they would blame you for it in some way. This is one of the very few ways that manipulators like to be behind other people and their manipulations. In other words, while manipulators tend to be very logical and intelligent, this is one of the few ways that they tend to come up short. By not following through with their word, they often can label themselves as liars without meaning to. If you are on the outside looking at a relationship, and you notice that one person is consistently making outrageous promises to the other person, then you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. On the flip side, if you are within a relationship that a person makes lots of promises to you in the beginning of your relationship and have not yet gone through with any of those promises, depending on the amount of time that has passed and the nature of his promises, you may be in a manipulative relationship. The 9th warning sign that you may be in a manipulative relationship is the feeling that manipulators make you feel as though you're always negotiating. This goes along with the way that manipulators use language to control their victims. Manipulators will twist your words and constantly make you feel as though you are attacking or attempting to negotiate everyday things with the manipulator. By constantly feeling as though you are in the act of negotiation, you're constantly being kept on your toes and made to feel unsafe and unsteady in your own relationship. An added bonus of this for the manipulator is that once you reach the end of your negotiation, even if it is about something completely nonsensical, you'll feel as though you've reached a middle ground with your manipulator. In reality, you will most likely have given the manipulator what they wanted in the first place. Because of a manipulator's prowess with the language, they will be able to convince you that you have gotten something out of the negotiation, when in reality, it wasn't a negotiation to begin with. It was just manipulation. This is very beneficial to the manipulator, because by convincing the victim that they are getting something out of the negotiation, they are keeping the victim happy, or at least make them believe that they are happy. And a victim that believes they are happy is one that will not try to fight back against their manipulator. If you are on the outside of a relationship looking in, you may be able to spot this telltale sign by an individual turning every single decision into a negotiation, and not simply agreeing to do one or the other thing at any point. If you spot this, you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. If you are inside a relationship, and you begin to notice that your significant other refuses to ever simply agree with you, and asks to argue with you over every single decision that you make, you may be in a manipulative relationship yourself. The 10th warning sign that you may be in a manipulative relationship is that manipulative people tend to lie on a consistent basis. Over years of manipulating those around them, this has probably become part of the daily routine of an emotional manipulator. These are not always big crazy lies about exceptional situations. Sometimes they can be about tiny, little, insignificant details. These small details may not always have anything to do with the end goal of a manipulator, but in fact may simply be a form of practice for the manipulator. Lying is a very baseline tactic for a manipulator, and so it is important for the manipulator to practice this skill constantly in order to stay good at it. By lying to their victims, a manipulator can basically make a victim believe whatever they want, as long as they are good at lying. If a manipulator gives away that they are lying, it can still benefit them, because the victim can feel as though they are unsafe and unsteady within their relationship, and not really know how to trust anyone. Having a lack of trust within a victim is good for the manipulator, because in order for a victim to get out of a manipulative relationship, they need the support of those around them. And if a victim is having trouble trusting those around them, then they will not be able to accept that support. If you are outside of a relationship, and you begin to notice that an individual is making outrageous claims that do not consistently line up with previous claims made by the same person, you may be looking at a manipulative relationship. Now that we have discussed some common signs that you may be in or looking at a manipulative relationship, we will discuss some of the ways to avoid a manipulative relationship. A good way to avoid finding yourself in that relationship is to keep a steady eye and watch out for these types of interactions that we have previously discussed. If you find that a person is exhibiting some of those characteristics, it would be in your best interest to stay away from them. Find excuses to not have to be near them. If for some reason you're incapable of staying away from a manipulative person, you simply have to avoid becoming a part of their manipulations by not falling into their traps. With all of the methods we have discussed, it should be fairly easy for you to spot and avoid these circumstances. Practice. Everybody knows that the learning of a new skill needs practice in order to do it better. That's exactly what we're going to do here. Within this section of the text, I will give the reader a series of examples, and the reader will try to decide whether or not the individuals in the example are participants of a manipulative relationship. I will follow up each of these examples with whether or not the relationship truly was manipulative and the reasoning why. Scenario A. John is known around the office as being the jokester. Not everyone in the office understands or even enjoys his jokes. People oftentimes find themselves feeling attacked or insulted by John's jokes. Nobody dares to bring this up to John, of course, because everybody else believes that everyone around them is having a good time. One day, George decides he has had enough. After a particularly scathing comment from John around the water cooler, George speaks up to give John some of his mind. "You're being very insensitive and just downright mean. I really wish you wouldn't make such insensitive and damaging jokes, John. You're a nice guy most of the time, but your jokes just go too far." Everybody in the group is taken aback for a moment. After a second, people in the group seem to begin to agree with George. They start nodding their heads, and one of them seems as though they are about to say something. Before anyone can speak up, however, John responds back in a minimizing tone. "Geez, George, I was only joking. I didn't know you were so sensitive. Can't you take a joke?" Everybody in the group immediately shuts their mouths and feels uncomfortable for calling out John's joke. Everyone in the surrounding group begins to feel like they don't have a sense of humor and just overall start to feel negative about themselves. As a result, John begins to take the stage once more, continuing on with his jokes. Is this manipulation? If you answered yes, you would be correct. This example is a form of minimization on the part of John. John is clearly making inappropriate or damaging remarks towards the other people in his office. When called out on his behavior, John chooses, instead of taking responsibility for his actions, to minimize what he has done by calling it a joke and making everyone around him feel uncomfortable and as though they have done something wrong. There are other examples of this that have nothing to do with jokes, of course. Similar examples are if somebody tries to vent and explain that they are feeling stressed on a certain day, a manipulator might respond with, "You don't know what stress is." In this situation, the manipulator minimizes a person's feelings by claiming that they are invalid and that they don't know what they're talking about. Scenario B. John and Erica have been dating for some time. John finds that soon after beginning his relationship, he has a lot of trouble locating items that he normally would have no trouble locating. These are items such as keys, pens, or even his wallet. He's also begun to notice that when it comes to information, he seems to be wrong about everything. Every time he tries to remember a situation that Erica was involved in, he remembers it incorrectly. Thankfully for him, Erica is always there to tell him properly what happened. John is also eternally thankful that he always has Erica there to show him where his keys are. I always make jokes about how awful his memory is and how, if his head wasn't screwed onto him, he would lose it as well. It's funny because when John thinks about it, he never had any of these issues before he started dating Erica. But then again, how can John trust what he remembers when he has so much trouble remembering where his keys are and basic information like what he did at the last party? Recently, it's begun to get so bad that John doesn't even like to bring up fun stories that he remembers because he knows he'll most likely get them wrong. Thankfully for him, Erica is always there to tell the story. People usually like it better from her anyway. One day, John began to wonder if maybe Erica was being a negative influence on him. But then he began to wonder if he was being too sensitive. Other people don't seem to have these issues with their relationships, so it must be me, he decided. He always finds himself apologizing to Erica. He's not even quite sure what he's done wrong most of the time. But with how awful his memory is, he doesn't even take a moment to second guess whether or not he's done something wrong. He simply assumes he has and doesn't remember it. One time, one of John's friends noticed that Erica had his keys in her pocket. When he brought this up to John, he laughed and waved his friend away, saying that Erica was most likely just saving them for him because she knew that he would lose them otherwise. John has also begun to notice that he tends to withhold information from his family because he's tired of their concerned questions. Making excuses or trying to explain Erica's actions towards him is just too exhausting. After a few weeks of all of this happening, John begins to realize that there might be something wrong with their relationship. John doesn't want to face up to the idea that their relationship might be toxic, and as a result, he decides to ignore this feeling and just move on. Besides, John decides if there is a problem with a relationship, it probably has something to do with him. He's probably not good enough for Erica anyways. Is this emotional manipulation? Absolutely. This is a type of emotional manipulation known as gaslighting. In gaslighting, a manipulator will try to find ways to make victims doubt their own thoughts, memories, or actions. At some point, the victim becomes too frightened to bring up a topic or a story for fear they'll be wrong about it or not remember it correctly. And in extreme cases, gaslighters will even create situations that will lead to the victim doubting themselves. In this example, we can see that Erica has been hiding John's keys, wallets, and other important objects so that he begins to feel as though he cannot trust himself to locate his own things. She also goes out of her way to make him feel as though he can't remember stories properly. Erica has put it into John's mind that he needs her to remember these things for him. John even goes on to point out that there may be something wrong with their relationship, but doesn't want to face the fact that Erica might be manipulating him. It's more comfortable, and he would just rather believe that he's the problem and that Erica really is good for him. This will damage him in the long run, but it would be more emotionally taxing for him to have to deal with it now, which is probably why he is not breaking up with Erica. Scenario C. Ben is a director of sales at a local paper company. He has an assistant named Karen. Ben and Karen have a very good relationship for a boss and his assistant. They're not perfect, of course. Karen has, on occasion, given him the wrong information, and Ben isn't always the most understanding of bosses. Ben always apologizes if he snaps at Karen, and Karen always corrects it if she has given him the wrong information. Is this emotional manipulation? No. This is not a sign of being in a manipulative relationship. It is within an assistant's job to do what their boss tells them to do, and it is within the boss's job to receive that information understandably, kindly, and correct. The relationship isn't perfect, but it is not intentionally manipulative. Chapter 8. Manipulation in the Workplace. Within this chapter, we will be discussing common signs of manipulation within the workplace. Sarcasm and offensive jokes. The use of thinly veiled sarcasm is often a form of manipulation that goes unnoticed in the workplace. Sarcasm in the workplace works to make an individual feel very uncomfortable and uncentered because it makes it hard to tell if an individual is being serious or not. In an area such as a workplace, where it is exposed, it can be hard to tell if someone is being legitimate when they're using sarcasm. In addition to this, people will often use defensive or scarring jokes to subconsciously harm the person they're trying to manipulate within the workplace. An offensive joke at another person's expense can make them feel uncomfortable and unsafe in their own work environments. By doing this, a manipulator is able to take away the safe feeling that the public work environment may bring to a victim. Devaluing the achievement of others. Another method of a manipulator in the workplace is the act of devaluing the achievement of those around them. By making individuals around them feel as though their achievements are not impressive or important in any way, they make the victims in the workplace worry about themselves, as well as making the manipulators seem better than them by insinuating that their achievements are not as impressive as the manipulators. By doing this, they develop a sort of respect from other people and make themselves appear to be more important than they truly are. In addition to this, the insecurities and self-consciousness that devaluing the achievement of the victim can bring opens up room for the manipulator to then come in and push their agenda onto the person. Putting down the opinions of others. Another method of a manipulator within the workplace is the putting down or an appreciation of the opinion of those around them. By making an individual feel that their opinion doesn't matter or has no real meaning in the world, makes an individual feel undervalued and unappreciated. This is helpful to the manipulator because it may lead to the victim coming to them, hoping for some level of value or appreciation. This will leave the victim in a vulnerable state in which all they want is to feel valued or appreciated, and they won't care about who it comes from. This leaves room for the manipulator to come in and push their agenda onto the victim. Not appreciating the work of others. Refusing to appreciate the work of those around you is another common method of a manipulator in the workforce. If an individual refuses to appreciate the work that people put in to make their everyday lives easier, then they can put those people around them down. But it can also make it easier for them to do their work. This makes their act of manipulating others easier and less difficult. Chapter 9. Manipulation and Defending Yourself Against It. Within this chapter, we are going to go through how you can defend yourself against each of the manipulation tactics that we have discussed. Most of our methods of defending ourselves against manipulation have to do with using positive self-esteem. Positive self-esteem is often used to overcome manipulation emotionally. Within this chapter, we will also cover several skills you can use to improve your self-esteem to help protect yourself against manipulators. Raising your voice. Previously in this text, we discussed how the act of raising one's voice can bring about panic in a victim, and as such, give a manipulator more power in a situation. If you find yourself in a situation in which you believe you are being manipulated by a person raising their voice against you, one of the best things that you can do in order to fight back against this form of manipulation is to maintain a sense of calm. If you can stay calm, you can very easily rationalize with the person trying to manipulate you. You can do this by taking a deep breath and pausing for a moment before giving a response to the person raising their voice at you. If you can give a calm and rational response to a person raising their voice at you, you take away the power that comes with shouting at another person. By showing the manipulator that you are not frightened or panicked by their loud actions, they themselves will become panicked. Please be warned and remember that in this moment of panic, you cannot be sure of what the manipulator is going to do. They may shout more and may become physically aggressive, or they may simply concede and leave. Either way, the best way to stand your ground and not succumb to the manipulation is to stay calm and collected and only give back to the person shouting at you rational and logical responses. You want to be careful with these responses because you want to make sure that you're not giving them any kind of ammo that they can use at you later. What I mean by this is you don't want to say anything accusatory or make it sound like you're insulting them in any way. You want to simply state facts and make sure that they understand that you're only stating what is actually happening. Acting superior. The best way to respond to somebody that tends to act superior to you is, if you can do it, simply stay away from them. The problem with this form of manipulation is that over time it becomes an instinct, and it may be that the manipulator may not know how to break this instinct by themselves. Because of this, as the victim, it is within your best self-interest to simply separate yourself from that person and to try to not be a part of their life anymore. If that is simply not an option for you, then the second best method is to try and get past somebody acting superior to you by completely ignoring their superiority complex. By not giving them the satisfaction of feeling second to them, you are robbing them of the entire reason that they act this way in the first place. This will probably make the manipulator very frustrated and angry with you. In fact, there's a very good chance that if you do this consistently for a long time, the manipulator may choose to not even concern themselves with you and will move on to an entirely different victim. The trick to this is not to take their attempts at acting superior seriously. Treat them as though a small child is trying to tell you how to do something that you know how to do. Ignore them, belittle them basically, throw the manipulation back into their face. Victimization. The best way to handle a manipulator acting like they are being victimized in their everyday life is not to give in to their want of sympathy. You can tell them, "I'm sorry, that must be really hard. I can't really help you," and that is fine. You cannot allow them to pull you into this idea that you need to fix them. That is when you fall into their manipulative trap. To avoid this, you have to let them know that you are not somebody that is going to fix them. Do not offer them suggestions because they will not want to take them. Do not try to make them feel better because it will not work. Simply accept that they feel that way and let them know that there is nothing you can do. This may be hard for some people to do because a feeling of empathy is a very strong, encouraging feeling within us from the time that we were small children. But if you really focus and put your mind to it, it is quite easy to logically understand why you cannot help every single person who tries to make you feel like they need your sympathy. Lying. The best way to deal with a manipulator that is constantly lying on a daily basis is quite simple but quite difficult to do. The best way to deal with this type of person is simply to cut them out of your life completely. While I understand completely that this is not always possible, and not super realistic for everyday life, it truly is the only way to completely and entirely stop somebody from lying to you. If someone can't speak to you in the first place, then they cannot lie to you. That's just a fact. Obviously, since this isn't something that we can just go out and do every single day, here's a couple of methods for dealing with liars that you simply cannot get rid of. The first thing to remember is that you need to always take what they say with a grain of salt. Always second-guess the things that they tell you, and don't take what they said to you at face value. This can be very exhausting. Second-guessing everything that someone tells you can quickly get old, but you have to be vigilant if you would like to be aware of this person's manipulations. You may have to fact-check things they say to you either literally, through the internet, or locally with some friends. Another method is to always have somebody around you when this person is speaking to you. It may be easier to pick up on this person's lies when the other person is not directly connected to them. So, if you have a friend who maybe doesn't like this person very much or simply doesn't know them that well, it would be in your best interest to keep that person around when you know you're going to be having long-winded conversations with this individual. If you use these tactics, you may be able to fight off a compulsive liar that is trying to manipulate you. It will, however, be very difficult, and I would strongly recommend simply cutting this person out of your life to begin with. It would be very difficult at the moment, but be very beneficial in the long run. Control. In order to counteract somebody that is trying to have complete and utter control over you, you have to simply not give in to their controlling tendencies. What I mean by this is that you cannot allow a person that makes you feel as though you have no control to know that they are making you feel like you have no control. If you give them that satisfaction, then they will know that what they are doing is working, and they'll continue to do it. Instead, you need to keep a constant mantra in your brain telling yourself over and over again that you have the power in your life, that you can make decisions for your own, and that the person who's trying to control you in reality has no control over your actions. It may be difficult to do this, and it may be beneficial to keep a strong support group of friends around you at all times. If you ever feel yourself beginning to doubt whether or not you have control over your life or your actions, you can always consult one of your friends, and I guarantee you that as long as they are not a manipulator themselves, they will assure you that you can make your own decisions. Other ways of keeping somebody from using their control to manipulate you is by going to somebody that has control over them. In a business setting, this can mean somebody that is the boss of your boss. If there is someone above that person that is supposed to be your boss, and you feel as though your boss is using unfair or inappropriate tactics to try and control you and your coworkers, it may be in your best interest to go to the person above your boss to discuss some kind of consequences or reprimands. As with all of these tactics, there's one more method you can use to avoid somebody who's trying to use their control over you to manipulate you. That is, of course, stay away from or cut that person out of your life. Once again, I know that this is a very difficult thing to do, and it is not always possible in the situation at hand, but if you can manage to do it, it would greatly benefit you in the long run. Somebody that has control over you may have an undying thirst to use that control to manipulate you. That is not necessarily something that you can change. It's similar to greed or addiction to power. This person simply wants to be in control at all times, and that's not necessarily something that you can fix. Coming to this conclusion is very difficult for some people, and sometimes can put you into a state of depression. Try to work through this in order to avoid staying with or near the person that is trying to control you. You'll be happier in the long run. Projection. A person that is projecting their problems onto you to manipulate you is not really looking for any kind of help. There's a chance that they need it, though. These individuals do not always know that they are projecting onto other people. Sometimes it's a subconscious action that they don't mean to do, but find themselves doing it without realizing it. A good way to help or change a person that is doing this is to contact their mental physician if they have one, and if they do not, contact a professional that you know yourself. Internal mental discrepancy, such as these, are not ones that average people should concern themselves with. These are things that professionals need to look into within an individual. As a normal person, it's not your responsibility to help somebody who is projecting themselves onto you. Finding them professionals who can help them discover why they tend to do this will be far more beneficial to you and them in the long run. Denial. To defend yourself against the manipulation tactics of denial, you have to first understand what a person who is doing the denying is trying to prevent by denying that thing. Let's say, for instance, that somebody denies an action that is their fault. Listen as they try to blame you for that action. What do you think they are trying to prevent from happening here? If they were to admit that it is their fault that they did a certain action, what would they be admitting to themselves? Once you understand the answers to these questions, you can begin to break down this person's wall of denial. This will be a very painful and difficult process for the person that has been doing the manipulation. But unless you want to try and cut this person out of your life entirely, this is the only way to go. You have to break down this person's wall of denial by making several statements towards them that prove that their actions are of their own choices. These are statements that primarily consist of explaining how nobody else can control that person's actions and how they are fully grown adults who can control their own decision-making. If you can succeed in doing this, you may be able to change the manipulator in your life. Be careful with this, because if you get too stuck into this mindset of trying to change a person who is manipulative in your life, you may begin to be manipulated by them again. So keep a safe distance while also tearing down their wall of denial. Intimidation. To fight back against a manipulator that's trying to use intimidation as a form of manipulation against you, you have to understand that you have nothing to be intimidated about. Please note that we are not discussing any form of physical intimidation within this section just yet. Intimidation within the economic or social sphere is a very powerful tool that a manipulator can use. You can take this power away from them by turning to those that are closest to you and that you believe would properly support you in the case that a manipulator tries to act on their threats. These are typically family members or very close friends. To stop intimidation from working on you as a form of manipulation, you have to stop yourself from allowing yourself to be intimidated. What I mean by this is you need to understand that most of the threats of somebody trying to intimidate you are usually empty. This means that you can realistically act of your own accord and ignore these threats without facing any damaging repercussions. If you are afraid this may not be the case, then it is important to keep that support group around you at all times. If you are not able to physically fight back against this intimidation, it may be within your best interest to cut this person out of your life entirely. Once again, this is a very difficult thing to do and follow through with, but once it is completed, it will greatly benefit you in your life. A person whose main form of manipulation is intimidation typically is secretly afraid of something. Typically, this is something that you have the power to wield over them. Once you can discover what this is, you can usually manage to convince that person to stop trying to intimidate you by wielding this power. The reason that the majority of people manipulate through intimidation is that they are scared of the person they're trying to intimidate. It's an interesting sort of irony how these two things work together. The fear that one has of another often convinces themselves to try and scare that person. In order to fight back against this, all you have to do is not be intimidated. Do not back down if they try to intimidate you or scare you. Stand up to them and be ready and willing to disagree with them. Obviously, in the case of physical intimidation, this is not the same advice that I would give. If you are scared of someone because they are physically intimidating, it may be in your best interest to get somebody in law enforcement involved, or somebody that can protect you in some way. It may be best to go the route of a restraining order in this situation. Restraining orders are very useful for these types of situations because they prevent the manipulator from getting close to you, and you are able to stand up to them without risk of harm. In the world of intimidation as a form of manipulation, it can be very difficult to stand up to the intimidator. If you stand strong and continuously have a support group that loves you and supports you, they will allow you to stand up to the intimidator in your life. You may even find that your intimidator was intimidated by you to begin with. Conditioning. There are two main types of conditioning that we have discussed within this text that is often used for manipulation. These two types are known as classical and operant conditioning. These types of manipulation are hard to protect yourself against because they can be hard to pinpoint. The good thing is, they are very easy to stop or change once you have realized that they are happening. If you start to notice that someone is conveniently doing nice things for you for no apparent reason, and you're beginning to feel unconsciously happy whenever you see them, you may be the subject of classical conditioning. The bad part about this is that it's somewhat already too late. You've already been conditioned to feel happy when this person enters the room. The good part about that is that we as human beings are smarter than dogs, so we are able to change these traits within ourselves. We can begin to fight back against this by starting to refuse the nice actions of these individuals. And you don't have to be mean about it, just say no thank you. You can continue by not acting on the operant conditioning that you may want to act on. How to use self-esteem to overcome manipulation. Self-esteem is a very important factor in the world of manipulative relationships. The majority of manipulation tactics rely very heavily on the low self-esteem of the victim. Because of this, if an individual begins to gain higher self-esteem, the manipulator may become hostile or start fighting to lower the self-esteem of the individual. Do not let this deter you, because that is what the manipulator wants. Having positive self-esteem about yourself can help you in manipulative relationships, because you will be less at risk for falling for the traditional manipulative traps. With higher self-esteem, you will not fall for degrading comments or let yourself be put down the way that somebody with lower self-esteem would. If you find that you already have pretty low self-esteem, here are some tips and tricks on how you can improve your self-esteem in the hopes of helping yourself in a manipulative relationship. Number 1, being mindful. That is pretty simple in the world of improving your self-esteem. This is simply becoming aware of the idea that you have low self-esteem. It's important to understand and accept the fact that you are having negative feelings about yourself if you would like to feel better about yourself. Helpful things to remember when you are trying to be more mindful is to remind yourself that the negative thoughts you have about yourself are only thoughts. They're not facts. Changing your story. Every person in this world has an internal narrative of what they believe are their core ideals and who they are. It's also to connect to our main self-image of ourselves. People with low self-esteem often have a negative self-image, and if they want to change that ideal, they have to understand where it's coming from and what voices are being internalized within us. Some negative ideas are repeated so often in our lives that we begin to believe that they may be true. The first step to understanding that these are not facts or to unlearn these phrases is to understand where they came from and to know what you wish you believed about yourself. Don't compare yourself. Comparisons amongst people are never good. If you find yourself comparing yourself to other people and feeling bad about yourself, the result is you may have low self-esteem. You need to remind yourself that nobody's perfect, and the person you are comparing yourself to isn't perfect either. This may be difficult to understand, but what you need to understand is that the person you're comparing yourself to has their own issues and problems, and even if you had what you like about them, you wouldn't be perfect either. Think about your positive skills. Every person in the world has their own set of special skills or weaknesses. Someone who is good at one thing is not going to be good at everything. If you wish to increase your self-esteem, you need to try your best to focus on some of your positive skills and things that you know you are very good about. Feeling confident in things that you enjoy will increase your self-esteem and help you to fight back against manipulators in your life. Conclusion. Within this text, we've covered a lot of information regarding manipulation and the psychology behind manipulative tendencies. In the very first chapter, I gave a brief explanation of manipulation psychology and the history of psychology of manipulation. I trace back the roots of manipulation to Aristotle's beliefs of persuasion in the ancient Greeks, while also giving some examples of manipulation in history. After doing this, I gave a brief explanation on why people choose to manipulate others and where manipulation tends to pop up the most in the average person's life. This is greatly helpful to a person who feels that they may be manipulated in their life. This chapter can help you see where you should look to check for manipulation. In the next chapter, I listed some of the common expressions of manipulation. In the next part of this chapter, it explains some of the most common tactics used by emotional manipulators. I went through the acts of raising your voice, acting superior to others, victimization, lying, and control over those around you. I explained how these tactics work and how manipulators may use them in context. This would be helpful to a person in pinpointing these types of manipulation in their lives. In the next chapter, I gave some in-depth techniques of manipulation. Some techniques are more complicated and had more difficult explanations than the last ones. These techniques were known as projection, denial, intimidation, conditioning, stalking, and much more. I went into detail on how these techniques of manipulation worked and how they can be used against others. I explained how words contribute to emotional manipulation due to our connection to language as a species. Within the next chapter, I began to go into the power of persuasion. I explained the origins of persuasions, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, with famous philosopher Aristotle explaining his 3 proofs in the art of persuasion. I also explained how persuasion could be used in everyday life and everyday scenarios. Moving on to the next chapter, I gave an in-depth explanation of a form of psychology known as neuro-linguistic programming. I explained the background of neuro-linguistic programming and how it could be used to manipulate those around you. Within the next chapter, I went into how we could use our learned skills to gain new friends in this world. I went through each of the skills that I taught during this text and explained how they could be used to win friends. In the next chapter, I began to discuss how we can avoid manipulation in a relationship. I explained how you can spot manipulation in a relationship that you are in or that friends of yours are in, and how you can avoid said manipulative relationships. I also gave some practice examples to help you pinpoint manipulative tendencies. These consisted of both scenarios in which somebody was manipulating somebody and in which someone was not manipulating somebody. I explained whether or not someone was being manipulated in each situation, and also gave an explanation on the type of manipulation that was being used and the tactics that were being implemented. This can serve as practice so that you can help yourself in trying to pinpoint manipulative tendencies and trying not to fall into a manipulative trap in the future. In the following chapter, I explained how you can defend yourself against manipulation in a relationship. I went through each tactic that we discussed within this text and explained how you can properly defend yourself against it. I also spoke briefly about self-esteem and how the use of positive self-esteem can help you overcome manipulation in your life. I also gave a list of tips and tricks on how to improve your self-esteem. I have greatly enjoyed opening up your world to the possibility of manipulation psychology and hope that you find a use for the information within this text. Make sure to check out my other book, How to Analyze People by Robert Leary. Thank you. I would like to share with you a free sneak peek at another one of my audiobooks that I think you will really enjoy. The audiobook is called How to Analyze People, and it's about how to instantly read a person like an FBI agent, analyze body language, and displaying confidence. Enjoy it. Common facial signs for different emotions. The following are a series of common facial signals that indicate different emotions. It is important to remember that some of these signs are not an instant indicator that a person is feeling the emotion in question. However, a combination of all of these signs may suggest that a person is feeling a certain emotion, depending on the environment surrounding them. Common signs of happiness. Some common signs of happiness within the face include, but are not limited to, the mouth and an open or closed smile, sometimes accompanied by laughter or chuckling. Possibly some crow's feet type wrinkles at the sides of a person's eyes. This indicates that a smile is honest and real because it is using enough muscles to change the wrinkles on a person's face. The eyebrows slightly raised, and a person's head tilted back are at a higher level than normal. Some common signs of sadness. Common signs of sadness within the face and head include, but are not limited to, a person's eyes staring downwards at a lower angle than 90 degrees. Possibly some dampness or moisture within the eyes. Head tilted downwards along with the eyes. Lips pinched tightly together or trembling. Trembling of the chin, and the head tilted to the side. Common signs of anxiety. Some common signs of anxiety within the face and head include, but are not limited to, eyes that are damp or filled with moisture, eyebrows that are pushed together and wrinkled, a lower lip trembling or lips pinched together, skin wrinkling or tenting, and head tilted downward, possibly looking at the ground. Common signs of fear. A few common signals of fear within the face and head include, but are not limited to, eyes wide open with large pupils, eyes closed or pointed downwards, eyebrows raised, wrinkling the forehead, open mouth or corners of the mouth turned downwards, chin pulled and tucked into the neck, head tilted downwards, possibly staring at the ground, and a white-tinted face. Common signals of anger. Some common signals of anger include, but are not limited to, eyes either wide and staring or squinted, eyebrows pushed downwards towards the eyes and possibly forever lower, a wrinkled forehead, nostrils that are flaring or twitching, a mouth that is flattened out into a line or teeth that are clearly clenched, a chin jutting out towards a person, and a face that is red in color. Common signs of envy or jealousy. Some common signals of envy or jealousy within the face and the head include, but are not limited to, eyes staring wide with pupils large, the corners of one's mouth turned downwards, crinkling of the nose or sneering at an individual, chin that's jutting outward away from the body. Common signs of desire or lust. Common signals of desire or lust within the face and the head include, but are not limited to, eyes open wide with heavily dilated pupils, eyebrows that are raised slightly but softly, lips parted slightly or puckered, stopping smiling, and head that is tilted forward or slightly tilted to the side at an angle. Common signs of interest. Some common signs of interest include, but are not limited to, a steady gaze of eyes toward the item or person in question. Some squinting also might happen in the eyes as a person attempts to see the item or person in question better. Eyebrows that are slightly raised, lips pressed tightly together, head straight or pushed slightly forward with the neck elongating, lips in a soft or gentle smile. Common signals of boredom. Some common signals of boredom within the face and the head may include, but are not limited to, eyes looking away from the object or individual in question, face generally unmoving but relaxed, corners of the mouth turned downwards or the lips pulled to the side, and head being held up with a hand or supported in some other fashion. Common signals of relief. Some common signals of relief within the face and head include, but are not limited to, eyebrows tilted outwards or lowered on the outer edges and higher on the inner edges, a mouth that is either slightly open or smiling, and a head tilted upwards in surprise. Common signs of surprise. Some common signs of surprise within the face and head include, but are not limited to, eyes wide open with pupils dilated, eyebrows pushed high onto the head with extreme wrinkling of the forehead, mouth open with a lower chin, and head that is tilted back or tilted to the side. Common signs of disgust. Some common signs of disgust within the face and head include, but are not limited to, head or eyes turned away from the object or person in question, nostrils flaring or nose twitching, nose crinkled or mouth snoring, mouth closed, tongue possibly sticking out, chin that's jutting out away from the neck and body. Common signs of shame. Some common signs of shame within the face and head include, but are not limited to, the head or eyes turning downwards looking at the ground, eyebrows low on the face but not forcefully so, and the skin may be bright red or flushed. Common signs of pity. Some common signs that somebody is feeling pity for another individual within the face and head include, but are not limited to, staring off into the distance, possibly with some dampness or moisture. Eyebrows pulled together slightly in the middle or pulled downward at the edges. Mouth corners turning downward, and head may be tilted to the side or tilted forward ever so slightly. Common signs of calmness. Some common signs that somebody is feeling very calm in an event or situation within the face and head include, but are not limited to, facial muscles that are relaxed, steady gaze looking forward with the eyes, and the mouth may be turned up slightly at the sides in a soft smile. How to fake your body language. Within this chapter, we will go through some easy and simple ways to fake your body language in order to come across as different emotions or different expressions to those around you. These methods can be beneficial in everyday life as well as in the workplace. They can also serve you well in starting out relationships for the first time. These methods also do a good job of helping you feel how you are trying to feel. Have you ever heard the cliche, fake it till you make it? Well, in some ways, this is true. By pretending to feel a lot of the emotions, you may be able to convince yourself that you actually feel this way. First, take a deep breath. By amplifying the supply of oxygen within our lungs, we can be given more power and more ability to fake our emotions through body language. This will also give us a moment to collect our composure and pretend to be calm and collected. In addition, deep breathing tends to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, which can trigger a relaxation response. This is very good, especially when trying to trick those around you into believing that you are calm and controlled in a situation. Deep breathing is a very good trick for mindful living, as it gives you more control over your body and your reactions to stimuli. Number 2, controlling the movement of your eyebrows. Our eyebrows can convey a lot about our inner feelings. A lot of movement from our eyebrows can convey feelings that you do not want to express. You need to be consciously aware of the movement of your eyebrows when you are trying to fake certain emotions through your body language. Number 3, trying not to use a fake smile. While it is good to smile, even if you don't feel like it, that is not always beneficial when faking your emotions through body language. While looking happy and bubbly may make others want to like you, it is not the best look to have constantly. Fake smiles are far too easy to see through, and humans are naturally inclined to try and search for any inconsistencies within somebody's smile. A better way to hide your emotions is to keep your mouth straight and not smile or be sad. Number 4, relaxing your face. By keeping your facial muscles relaxed, you can more easily control the movements of your face. Stay away from movements such as teeth grinding, frowning, or displaying any other type of emotional expression. Having relaxation and a calmer look on your face makes it more easy to better control the emotions you are putting out through your body language. Number 5, supporting your head. A person's head that is being held up by an individual or a face buried into one's palm is a very obvious and clear giveaway of a bad mood or sadness. It is better to keep your head held up high and your neck and back straight in a situation where you feel sad, but you do not want those around you to know that you're feeling sad. Another important thing to remember is to try and stop yourself from touching your face when you're feeling sad, as that is a strong sign of anxiety and stress. Number 6, Avoid fidgeting. Moving suddenly or very quickly are obvious signs of discomfort and anxiety. If you try to relax your body and try to look as though you are comfortable where you are, then it can be easier to control your emotions and feelings. It also becomes harder for those around you to decipher what you feel because you simply look calm and relaxed. Number 7. Speaking in a balanced tone. This one is very important. If you want to come across as anything other than how you are currently feeling, you may want to take a moment to think about what you're going to say and speak in a balanced tone and even tone to those around you. The tone of your voice can give away your thoughts faster than you could think. Speaking too fast or changing your tone very quickly and frequently is an obvious sign that you aren't quite sure what you are trying to emote or what you are feeling. Try to slow down before you answer any questions. In addition to this, try to speak with your mind in a logical setting. You will want to focus exclusively on facts and remove any emotion from the situation. Through focusing on facts, you can stop your body from exclusively feeling the said emotions and focus on the task at hand. Number 8. Trying to disassociate. If you can manage to detach yourself from a situation you are in, it will become much easier to control your body language and the emotions that you are showing. An easy way to do this is to think of happy thoughts as good memories. Doing this will help you take your mind off whatever is happening around you, and it'll make it more challenging for others to read your thoughts. By detaching yourself from the situation around you, you will more easily be able to see the logical side of what is happening and be able to accurately portray the particular body language and emotions that you want to show. Number 9. Speaking to yourself. You will be able to tell your mind to think about the way that it should. This will make it easier to control your body language and your emotions as you are in the process of controlling your own mind. If you enjoyed this preview of my audiobook, How to Analyze People, be sure to check out the full audiobook on audible.com. This has been Covert Manipulation. Learn persuasion and manipulation techniques you need to influence people through emotional intelligence, dark psychology, and NLP. Win friends, persuade, and manipulate. Written by Robert Leary. Narrated by Ivan Bazinius.
The end. We hope that you have enjoyed this production. Consider supporting us on Patreon with as low as $1, link in bio. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.